Jason Smith had never pretended to be something he wasn't. At school, everyone knew him as the son of a successful businessman. At university, he was considered a major who could not afford anything: money, cars, pretty girls, and revealing dresses. And even as the owner of the company, he managed to maintain the image of a wealthy bachelor and pro-lifer. Now Jason was about to become a hobo. That's what they wear on the street. He won't recognize me. He won't recognize me. Unless I take the janitor stuff. You know, the one who quit a long time ago. I was going to throw it away. And now I have the chance, the boy puzzled. Of course, the idea of learning from vagrants belonged only to him and no one else. In fact, plainer clothes would have sufficed. But Jason wanted to transform himself so that in case of an unexpected meeting, he wouldn't be recognized even by his own mother.
He'd bought makeup and a wig, and he'd dusted off the clothes he was supposed to wear, stomped sneakers he had never had, and therefore had to build them artificially. Jason smiled at his reflection in the mirror. He was looking at a grimy guy, old, fat, wearing tattered jeans and a baseball cap with the visor missing in several places.
There, that's better, he whispered with a smile and headed off to meet the woman he was supposed to see for the first time. Jason knew he was being reckless, of course, but he had no other choice. He'd given his word 2 days ago, and he was sure he'd keep it no matter what.
When Jason had left the house, his gait and demeanor had changed. Now he was a vagabond with a running gaze and a cautious, almost cat-like step. As he approached the cafe building, he looked around and pulled the doorknob with a determined look. At that moment, the thoughts in the businessman's head ran backwards, involuntarily bringing him back to the time when everything had just begun. And it had begun with an event that at first glance had nothing to do with the subsequent scheme.
Paul Smith glanced at the face of his wristwatch and grumbled unhappily. Well, where's he been hanging around? Is it really possible to be late for a meeting like this? Then the businessman shifted his gaze to the small briefcase that lay on the table at his right hand. A satisfied smile immediately appeared on Paul's face. The briefcase contained money, not so much to marvel at the amount, but not so little as to underestimate its power. In Paul Smith's hands, money was the means by which he intended to acquire a firm whose owner had recently declared bankruptcy. The businessman glanced again at his watch. Has he changed his mind? What if he doesn't come, or finds the proposed deal unimportant? The firm is not bad on the whole. Only time and effort will be required. Finally, the door of the restaurant opened and Brian appeared in the lobby. A confident gait, a haughty look, and a hypertrophied sense of self-importance that was felt by everyone who met his gaze. Paul Smith felt it too, when the long-awaited owner of the company unceremoniously plumped into a chair in front of the astonished businessman. He asked, "Well, are you ripe? Are you buying, or have you changed your mind while you were collecting money? Because I might find another buyer." Paul paused for a moment to prevent the insolent man from seizing the initiative, then replied,
"No, I haven't changed my mind. It's all on the table. You have the money with you, I hope." Paul grinned. "With me, of course. What are we talking about?" Brian pulled some papers out of a folder and held them out. Of course, the long notarization of the deal was ahead of them, but the first and major step had been taken right here in the restaurant.
"Why don't you want to get the firm off the ground yourself? How many years has it been idle? Why are you selling it so cheaply? It's much more profitable to grow your own business than to get money from selling it, losing all the profits," Paul asked. Brian wrinkled his nose. To tell the truth, he was annoyed by this polite UN business courtesies. But if he could get a grip on himself, he might not even notice the trouble. Why be nervous about nothing? But Brian did answer the question.
"Why do I need this firm? I'll find another one, no problem. How many bankrupt firms are there in the city? There's always some loser who's going to go bad at some point. There's this little firm, owned by some girls before me. Naive, simple as a cork. So I taught them a lesson, and at the same time, I took over the company, but not me, so someone else. What difference does it make?"
Paul Smith shook his head. Feeling the intense irritation of dealing with this insolent bugger, he knew that Brian was a vulture, a man who bought up bankrupt businesses for next to nothing and sold them for a lot more. There were rumors in town that in some cases Brian himself helped owners go bankrupt, acting by raiding methods.
Finally, the preliminary agreements were reached, and the partners left the restaurant. Paul Smith exhaled a sigh of relief. Dealing with Brian had been worth it, especially considering his business partner's bad reputation. He also wanted very badly to wash his hands with soap and water, as if he had touched something dirty and disgusting before. On the other hand, he hadn't done anything wrong and had just bought the firm that Brian had resolved. Not him, someone else. As they say, no big deal. At least Paul Smith's son will now be in business and won't be going to the pubs and nightclubs. Well, that'll be a test for him. a test of strength, so to speak.
The insistent trill of the alarm clock jerked Jason out of a deep sleep. He cringed and opened his eyes with difficulty, whispering, "Oh, I have to go to work again." Damn it, there was a simple explanation for the heavy awakening. Jason had stayed up late last night working on paperwork and had gone to bed after midnight. Now his body was taking revenge on its master and refusing to work as it should. Jason got out of bed and went to the bathroom to take a contrast shower.
At the moment, it was the only thing that would bring him back to life and make him finally wake up from his shower. Jason brewed a strong cup of coffee, which finally cheered him up and put him in the mood for work. He had only recently taken over the firm after his father had bought him a company that had been declared bankrupt. Of course, he could have put his own business in his son's hands, but he was in no hurry to do so and took a wait-and-see attitude.
Jason understood this and worked hard to prove his father's worthiness. Paul Smith started at the bottom, and the firm was his brainchild. Sometime back in the 90s, he left the factory and plunged into the turbulent waters of business. Jason was a late bloomer. I guess you could say he suffered. Paul and Sarah had gone to all kinds of places and tests. Nothing. The pregnancy either failed early or never came at all, and the age was such that they could not waste time thinking about it. And when they were about to adopt a boy from an orphanage, a real miracle happened. The pregnancy test showed such a desirable 2 stripes. However, this in itself did not mean anything, because Sarah was afraid that she would not be able to bear a child. Paul then was not himself, literally carried his wife in his arms. Despite the fact that the entire pregnancy Sarah was worried about severe intoxication, dizziness, the birth itself was surprisingly easy. Paul's happiness knew no bounds. At last he would have an heir. What could be better? But the older his son got, the more Paul began to doubt that he would be able to lead their family business.
Jason was too frivolous and wasteful. Restaurants, nightclubs, and expensive cars. Of course, Jason wasn't what you'd call a spendthrift. Anyway, he was thinking about the future, and he was even dating the girl he considered his fiancée. Violet, like Jason, had grown up in a wealthy family. At first glance, they had plenty to talk about.
On the other hand, Jason felt that he lacked a breath of fresh air and a sense of freedom when he was with his fiancée. Violet was predictable to the point of boredom, thinking only of beauty salons, restaurants, and expensive things. Of course, Jason wasn't a saint either, but he still wanted something different, something that would make him cheer up and savor life. Because of that, he occasionally threw rowdy parties, where he tried to get rid of his feelings of longing and loneliness. But on the other hand, such qualities could lead to the decline of the family business, which had always been the #1 goal in his father Paul Smith's life. No, this can't go on indefinitely. Something has to change, or his pubbing and partying will drive him into bankruptcy, Paul had said at dinner one night. Sarah looked at her husband anxiously, as any mother would. She was devoted to her son, and was willing to forgive him for his misdeeds. "Honey, but Jason is still so young. Who doesn't make mistakes at his age?" Sarah said. Paul pressed his lips together unhappily. "Mistakes? His mistakes have been costing me too much lately. Michael Johnson is the same age as Jason, and he's already helping his father. He could be a nightclubber, too." Sarah wanted to say something in defense of her son, but stopped halfway through. It was a waste of time to argue with Paul when he was in this state. Then again, Jason could get hurt. It was better to wait out the storm and choose a more convenient moment to talk. But Paul wasn't going to stay silent that night, and he wasn't going to avoid the hot topics of conversation. "Here's what I'm thinking. Sarah, I'm going to buy him a company. I've been looking at one recently. They're selling it for pennies. The former owner went bankrupt. They found the debt. And this direction is the most promising. If you're smart about it and set up a workflow, you won't have any problems for a long time." "What if Jason doesn't succeed?" "It's not an easy job, and he has no experience at all," his mother asked anxiously. "It's okay. It's something you can learn. He'll figure it out. I think it's not for nothing that he studied at university for so many years. Now let him prove himself." Sarah bit her lip painfully, imagining how hard it would be for her son. Of course, Jason didn't know any of this and continued to enjoy his life. The epiphany came when his father handed him the controlling interest in the company and the keys to the office. "Here, son, take it. This firm belongs to you now. Your future depends on how you run it," Paul said. Jason looked at his father in surprise, but accepted the offer. Where could he go? His carefree life was over. He shrugged his shoulders and took the job. True. Then the guy did not know what awaited him in the near future. Managing the firm for only a month, Jason faced a severe shortage of staff, especially cleaners and security guards. The problem was that most of the staff had quit. Those that remained had long since given up any hope. To say that Jason was having a hard time was an understatement. Every day he faced a lot of problems, and he had forgotten his old life. No more partying until the wee hours of the morning, no more eating at expensive restaurants. Now, when he came home, he cooked himself a quick dinner and then sat down to study documents and reports for the last quarter. Only now he realized how deluded he had been, that he was familiar with every term in business. The reality was much sadder. At one point, Jason had given up and decided to give up, but then he immediately remembered the stern face of his father, who would once again prove him right. "No, I'll take it all for sure. There's no way out," Jason said to himself like an incantation. And today, going to work, he thought only of how to increase the firm's income and achieve financial independence. Even if it was small, it was still financial independence. The thing was that Paul Smith had told his son at once that the money injected into his company would be minimal, and therefore he should not count outside help. Jason got behind the wheel of his foreign car, drove onto the highway and headed toward the center. Fortunately, there was no traffic, and he got there on time, leaving the car in the parking lot. Jason picked up his briefcase and walked briskly towards the firm's building. At that moment, the young businessman's attention was attracted by a girl of about 6 or 7 years old, who was laughing and jumping happily next to a huge flower bed. Seeing the little girl, Jason was about to pass by when the girl asked him, "Uncle, I bet I can jump for 10 minutes and not get tired." Jason stopped and looked at the girl in disbelief. "Not likely. By the way, I don't have time to time it either. I have to go to work. But the fact that you can't is a fact." The little girl smiled. "You can't. I will definitely be able to. Want to bet on a wish or a weakness?" Jason smiled. Without wanting to, he had already taken the bait the little girl had prepared for him. He hadn't noticed that he'd gotten caught up in the argument, which had come out of nowhere. He glanced at his watch and said, "All right, let's check it out. Just be warned, the calculation will be real. If you lose, and you're bound to lose, I'll ask you to learn the biggest poem in the school curriculum. What's your name, anyway?" "My name is Emily, Uncle." "Jason." "Okay, let's get started before we change our minds," Emily said. Jason nodded, and the girl started. Frankly, watching this picture, he felt an unparalleled sense of mental comfort. Jason had gotten so sick of the whole business over the past month that he was glad for any opportunity to take a break from it, even through a simple argument with the little girl. Jason was also a gambler, and when Emily had approached him with a suggestion of an argument, she had hit the bull's eye. As is the norm in a real contest, the stopwatch on her smartphone was turned on, and Emily started jumping. As the allotted time expired, Jason became more and more convinced that he had lost the bet. It seemed that the little girl could have bounced for more than 10 minutes, but could have broken the record for this type of athletic competition. "Yeah, good for you." There are simply no words. "I'll be honest, I didn't expect it," Jason said respectfully. "Thank you, Uncle. I've been practicing for a long time. Are you ready to pay your debt?" "I'll learn a poem for you anyway, so you won't be so offended," Emily said with a smile. "And what do you want?" "Money." "Sweets?" Jason asked with barely contained irony. Emily hesitated for a moment, then looked him carefully in the eye. "And my wish is this. Ask my mom out on a date, Uncle. Just this once." Jason shook his hands indignantly. "No way. Why just a date? Why don't you ask her to marry you, or propose to her?" "I actually have a fiancée." Emily shook her head disappointedly. "Come on. I wasn't counting on anything anyway. All you rich people are the same. All you know how to do is lie." The girl's words disarmed Jason, and what he'd thought of as an innocent joke suddenly took on a different meaning. He didn't want to deceive the girl, especially since he could tell from her appearance that she'd grown up in a poor family. Trying to make it up to her, Jason mumbled embarrassedly, "All right, a bet is a sacred thing, as is a debt. I always pay my bills. Tell me what's what." A cute smile immediately appeared on Emily's face. "Okay, Uncle, but when you ask my mom out, go easy on her. She doesn't like you rich people very much." Jason nodded, and despite the limited time, listened to her confused explanations. Then he wished Emily a good day and gave her his word that he would keep his promise. He didn't know exactly how Jason would do it, though, so he decided to take a moment to think it over. The meeting with this girl had stirred up feelings in the businessman's soul that he hadn't even realized he had. For the next 2 days, Jason couldn't think of anything else but the upcoming date. He was aware that the whole thing was a hoax, a sham. "It's okay, I'll just go once, and then I can forget about this Emily thing," Jason told himself. On the morning of the appointed day, the little girl came up to him, and said, "Uncle Jason, I've already arranged everything," and warned Mommy, of course. I had to fantasize a little. "But you'll forgive me, won't you?" The businessman smiled. "I forgive you, of course. You're doing your best for your mom. Do you want to make it better? Well, then come to the cafe at 6:00 p.m. The one around the corner. How will I recognize her? We haven't met, have we?" Jason wondered. Emily thought for a moment, then said, "Don't worry, you'll recognize her. She'll have a dress like this. It's all polka dots, and it's nice." "Yeah, you'll know right away." Jason smiled and pressed his hand to the left side of his chest in gratitude. The whole thing seemed like an adventure to the businessman, an adventure that would cheer him up and entertain him. And now, entering the cafe as a tramp, Jason felt an unparalleled excitement. A woman in a dress would appear, and he would have to play the part of the suitor for the evening. But no sooner had he crossed the threshold of the cafeteria than a guard blocked his path. "Where are you going? You must have the wrong address. This is not a social canteen. Don't even count on a free meal." Jason froze at the security guard's surprise and insolence. Then, forgetting he was wearing a hobo outfit, he grabbed his assailant by the lapel of his jacket. "What do you think you're doing, asshole face? What, you want a tip? I'll give you a couple of slaps and take you to your master by the ear. Then you'll know how to greet respectable people. You're the respectable one, all right? And God be with you. Drink some, psycho," the guard hissed. Jason smiled victoriously and glanced at his reflection in the mirror. "Why am I so angry? Keep your voice down, be out of line," the businessman told himself. He didn't notice Emily's mom right away. As it turned out, she was sitting at the same table in the cafe the girl had mentioned. Jason came closer and said politely, "Good evening. My name is Jason. May I sit at your table?" The stranger smiled and gestured to a chair. "I have a seat, of course. My name is Jennifer." Jason was about to say something in response when a waitress came to their table and handed him a menu with a squeamish look. The disguised businessman took it in his hands and only now realized he'd forgotten to take cash. He had a bank card with him, and more than one. But how would he explain the unlimited card to the woman he was talking to? Jason blushed and realized he'd have to give up the expensive orders. Flipping through the menu pages, he tried to choose something more or less acceptable. "Why don't I order?" "It's no trouble at all," Jennifer asked with interest. Jason was ready to fall to the ground in shame. He held out the menu with a trembling hand and lowered his eyes guiltily. "Don't be embarrassed. It's okay. I'm paying." "Other times you pay," and where even the woman added as gently as she could. Jason almost choked in amazement. "Other times? What's she talking about? Is there going to be that second time with the order placed?" Jennifer quickly turned the conversation to distract the tramp from the thought of payment. The speech was so proper and pleasant that Jason couldn't help but listen. Jennifer had told him everything about herself consistently and methodically, so Jason learned that she now worked in an office where she was constantly being abused. When the businessman heard this, he immediately became animated. Jason was about to make a job offer when he stopped short. "Where are you going in such a hurry? Have you forgotten? In real life, you're a wealthy businessman. Here, you're just a common vagrant, so act accordingly." The guy's mind raced. Luckily, Jennifer didn't notice anything and continued talking about herself. Jason was so engrossed in the conversation that he didn't notice the time passing. Despite her obvious desire to talk, Jennifer was reluctant to talk about the time period that had begun after graduation and had stretched to the present day. "What about Emily's father? And where is she?" Jason asked cautiously. It was an awkward question, and Jennifer's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "My husband left me. He'd left me for someone else when he found out his daughter had a congenital heart defect." That confession took Jason's breath away. "What does that mean?" "Emily's sick. But how does she jump rope so fast? It's not healthy. We were very lucky. I was able to find the money for the operation. I don't remember anything about it. I don't really want to talk about it," Jennifer explained, catching the surprised look in his eyes. Jason nodded restrainedly, though he was in the midst of a storm of emotions. An ordinary cleaning lady had found such a huge sum of money to save her daughter. It was unbelievable. They talked a little longer, and then they were finally convinced of their sympathy for each other. The more Jason listened to her, the more he liked her. Jennifer seemed so natural and real to the businessman, like a young mother should be, even if she was raising her daughter alone. Toward nightfall, the cafe began to fill with people. Jason mentally thanked Jennifer for taking a table away from the entrance, so they could have almost complete privacy. Jason also decided that he would invite Jennifer back to the cafe, but only then would he pay for the entire order. Deep down, he regretted having agreed to the whole outfit. Emily had asked him to come dressed in a simple, plain outfit, but Jason had taken his fantasies a step further and turned into a hobo. Suddenly, Jason's attention was drawn to a group of young men who, laughing loudly, were already insulting the waitress. Out of the corner of his eye, the disguised businessman saw that there were 3 guys and 3 girls sitting at the table. One of them looked vaguely familiar. Jason took a closer look and was almost sickened by what he saw. It was Violet, his fiancée, who often cited a headache and refused to let him date her. She herself, openly deceiving the groom, spent time with friends. Not only that, but smiling and laughing, Violet kissed her companion on the cheek without embarrassment, as she had once done with Jason. He clenched his fists, his body tensing with resentment. In another second, he was ready to get up from the table and head toward the group. Sensing Jason's inner turmoil, Jennifer gently took his hand and tried to reassure him. "Come on, don't worry about it. What do they care? Their parents must be rich, so they make fun of those who are weaker. It's okay. Life will sort things out." Jason looked at Jennifer in surprise. How could she know such a thing when she'd spent most of her time working quietly in an office? He didn't want to offend her with that answer, though, so he quickly suppressed his anger and turned the conversation in another direction. But he couldn't forget the evening's incident, for he kept glancing at the table where Violet and her boyfriend were sitting. It was only a couple of days ago that she had been swearing her love to him, telling him of her impending marriage, which she was looking forward to. When it got dark outside, Jennifer started to get ready to go home. She paid the bill and then asked Jason to walk her home. "I can't stay any longer. I'm sorry, of course, but if you feel like it, we can meet again," she said. "I didn't really want to come to the cottage. She said you were like a recluse sitting at home, so I decided to give it a try. I don't regret it, by the way." Jason smiled. "Sure, I'll see you around. You don't doubt it. I really enjoyed it, too." Taking Jennifer's hand, the disguised businessman carefully led her toward the exit, trying not to look at the table where Violet and her buddies were sitting. Unfortunately, Jason didn't manage to maneuver out unnoticed, because one of the drunken young men immediately gave Jennifer an obscene compliment. Then he grabbed her arm. "Beautiful. Where are you going? Come join us, you won't regret it." "That's enough," Jason said through gritted teeth. "Let go if you don't want any trouble, and we'll just leave." The young man laughed cheekily. Then he got up from the table and shoved Jason roughly in the chest. He'd been standing half-turned the whole time, so that Violet wouldn't recognize him, but now he could stop pretending and respond to his assailant the way he deserved. Jason didn't wait for a second shove, and immediately slapped the rich man in the back of the head. The rich man staggered. Then his 2 buddies went into action. Violet recognized the tramp's features as those of her fiancé, Jason, who looked just like him. When the waitress saw that a fight was breaking out, she shouted loudly and then rushed to the front desk to call the police. The drunken majors dragged Jason outside, where the 3 of them began beating him. Jason turned around, kicked his assailants, and fought like an enraged lion. But still the forces were unequal. The most interesting thing was that Violet stood back and watched carefully, not feeling any pity for her fiancé. Jennifer, on the other hand, didn't abandon Jason and tried to fend off the attackers with her small purse. Soon the siren of an approaching police car sounded around the corner. The 3 friends scattered at once. Violet stayed where she was. Looking into Jason's bloody face, Violet snarled, "Yeah, I didn't think you'd trade me for this. Tell me, aren't you ashamed of yourself? I wonder what your father will say when he finds out his little boy is spending his evenings with a bum." Jason shouted something back, but there was no time to talk. He struggled to get up from the pavement and, supported by Jennifer, walked up the street. The cops didn't bother to catch up with the guy because they realized right away that he was the victim of the attack, so there was no point in detaining him. "So, do you know this girl?" "You know, the fiancée of one of those scoundrels," Jennifer asked on the way home. Jason gave a sort of inarticulate shrug, letting her know that he seemed to know, but not close enough to take her words seriously. "What did he mean about your dad? Didn't you say you grew up in an orphanage? Or did you know your father?" Jennifer persisted. Jason didn't want to talk about this awkward subject right now. He was waiting for a moment to step out of the shadows and into the light. Jason mentally promised himself that he would tell Jennifer the truth, but not now, not while his face was covered with blood and he looked like a beaten puppy. "If you're not offended, I'll tell you all about it later. When I come to my senses," Jason tried to change the subject. Jennifer nodded and didn't say a word the rest of the way. She was probably offended. Jason could feel it in his heart. But as soon as he tried to force himself to tell the truth, something inside him started to protest and prevent him from doing what he planned. As it turned out, Jennifer lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. She waved her hand and closed the gate behind her, dryly thanking him for a wonderful evening. And the overdressed businessman stood for a long time looking at her windows, in which the light was burning. When the lights finally went out, he realized that his mother and daughter had gone to bed, which meant he had to go home. Jason walked down the moonlit road and thought about how unpredictable life was. Yesterday, he'd been thinking about and preparing for his wedding to Violet. But today, he'd learned something that made the thought of marriage seem repugnant. At least he had met a good woman whom he had fallen in love with at first sight. Not long ago, he thought that all this would be an ordinary prank, an attempt to cheer up, to dilute the monotony of his life. Jason walked into the living room at midnight and picked up the smartphone on the table and saw several notifications. Jason hadn't miscalculated by leaving it at home, but had done it deliberately, because he knew that if it rang during the date, it would be very difficult for him to explain to Jennifer that he had the latest smartphone. The notifications came from Paul Smith, the father. Predominantly all of them were voicemail. Jason listened to them one by one and got a real shock. The fact was that Violet had called her father-in-law the same evening. She vividly described the meeting with Jason in the cafe. She told the businessman that his son, dressed as a homeless man, was meeting with a beggar. Paul Smith immediately decided that his son was broke and on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Despite this, the businessman still found the strength to call his son and find out what happened. "Tell me, please, do you have anything in your head, or are you completely crazy? I wanted you to take care of the firm's affairs, to become more serious, and instead you are fighting with your fiancé and preparing to marry some beggar," Paul Smith raged. "Paul Smith, stop it. Jennifer is not a bum. Violet's lying. She was in a cafe with some guy she was kissing and hugging. If I hadn't gone there to meet Jennifer, I don't think I would have known about it," he tried to justify himself. But Paul Smith wouldn't listen. He was ruled by an anger that only time could temper. Jason was well aware of that, so he put the conversation off indefinitely. That night, he didn't sleep much, thinking only of Jennifer and her daughter Emily. Then the businessman sadly realized what a mistake he had made by pretending to be a vagrant. After all, if he had come in his usual clothes, he could now help Jennifer with her work by taking her to his office, for example. Now, how would that look? Yesterday's tramp dressed in an expensive suit and offering his lady of his heart to mop the floor of his office. Jason was also afraid that Emily would talk and tell her mother the truth. He didn't fall asleep until morning, about half an hour before the alarm clock rang. He struggled to get his eyes open, feeling broken and tired from the day's events. Jason wasn't going to despair, because he realized that he was going to have a serious conversation with his father, and possibly something else to do with his company. As Jason left the car in the parking lot, he noticed Emily again, just as he had on the day of their first meeting. She was standing next to a flower bed, clutching a children's storybook in her hands. "Thank you, Uncle Jason. You've been a great help to my mom. You know, she's literally blossomed. I've seen that in movies, so I thought I'd try it in real life." Jason smiled. "Thank you too, sweetheart." "I haven't had such a good time in a while," he replied with a smile. After talking some more, he asked the girl to ask her mom out again. Only now Jason knew that he wouldn't go back to the cafe and would limit himself to a walk in the park. "Okay, I'll be sure to tell her. You can be sure of that. Mom seems to be looking forward to it," Emily said. Jason walked into the office and began his usual routine. Unfortunately, he didn't know that one of Violet's acquaintances had blown the whistle on the fact that the owner had spent the evening in the company of a commoner. The role of Violet, who had been cheating on Jason left and right without shying away from her fiancé status, had been cleverly hushed up. Before the businessman could calm down and get into the next report, his father burst into the office. "What do you think you're doing, puppy? Do you know that I was counting on your marriage to Violet? After all, her father can help us in times of need, back us up, give us a shoulder to lean on. They say marriages like this are made in heaven, you know, and you let yourself have an affair on the side. How am I supposed to look Violet's father in the eye?" Jason looked down guiltily, then answered, "I didn't betray her. She did it all on her own. I just lost an argument and had to go to the restaurant, but now I don't regret it one bit, because I found someone close to my heart." Paul Smith shook his palm at the air. "You were a clueless kid, and you still are. Lost the argument. Duty of honor. You're supposed to be thinking about business, not your own ambitions. What have you turned this office into? Why are the floors so dirty? Don't you have the money to hire a cleaning lady?" "Why not?" "I do. She just quit without giving a reason, out of the blue. I'll put an ad in all the local papers today and come hang it out front," Paul Smith objected, grumbled some more, and then left. He didn't want to quarrel, especially since Jason had to make his own life according to his plan. How could he not? What kind of businessman would he be? A puppet without a voice of his own? And he'd be eaten up by the competition. There's a lot of sharks out there. You just gotta hang on. When his father left, Jason breathed out a sigh of relief and wiped the sweat from his forehead. It had gone a little easier than he'd expected. He instructed the secretary to post the recruitment announcement. Jason went back to studying the paperwork. Meanwhile, Violet was complaining to her father about her fiance's betrayal. Can you imagine? I walk into a cafe with my friends, and there he is sitting with this beggar. But I made a scandal, as I should. Greg Johnson frowned. I didn't expect that from Paul Smith. There's nothing to say, and I thought I'd back him up, stand up for him. They say there's an inspection coming from the region. They're going to shake them all down and won't rest until they've arrested someone. I think we already have one candidate. The main thing is to decide whether it's better to hand over the father or the son. Violet grinned happily. Jason, of course. Let him know what real betrayal feels like. And you won't feel sorry for him. You don't approve of the situation either, do you? What's there to feel sorry for? He's been messing with my head, and I've been suffering, dried up from love, and he wants new ones. And now I don't need him anymore. I have a better suitor. Someone with experience and ambition, Violet said with a meaning look at her father. And who is this handsome man? Do I know him? Greg Johnson asked with a surprised raised eyebrow. Brian is his name. He's a guy with ideas not unlike this Jason guy. He's also got business experience. With him, we'll nail them in no time. Greg nodded, but he decided not to jump to conclusions. Time would tell him what was going to happen. If Violet wanted to put her abuser away, it would be a good idea not to get in the way. It would be a lesson to others. While Jason was working on the paperwork in the office, his secretary was surprisingly quick and immediately posted the job ad on all the internet sites in the city. The calculation was correct, and soon everyone who was actually meant to receive it knew about it. As it happened, it was Jennifer who was the first to respond, and she decided to come to the office immediately. As she approached the building, she suddenly felt an unparalleled excitement and trembling in her hands. Tears came to her eyes and her lips turned into a solid, thin line. Climbing the stairs was difficult, as if Jennifer were climbing the summit of Mount Everest. Opening the door, she stepped carefully across the threshold and found herself in a room that felt so familiar and cozy it took her breath away. "Did you want something?" the guard at the entrance asked. Jennifer flinched. Finally coming to her senses, she said, "Hello, I'm interested in a job. The ad says you're in need of a cleaning lady." "It does, doesn't it?" The guard lazily pointed his hand down a long hallway. "I think you should check with the director. Go straight ahead until you come to a brown door." "Thanks. I know where that is," Jennifer replied timidly and walked in the direction the guard pointed. What was her surprise when she saw her acquaintance from yesterday, Jason, in the chair in charge. "Jennifer, what are you doing here? Why didn't you give me a heads up?" the businessman exclaimed, blushing like cancer. "What am I doing? You'd better tell me. What's the meaning of all this masquerade? Did you want to laugh at my misfortune? I'm right to say that I sheltered a lonely mom and gave her hope. It's selfish. I'll give you that." Jason turned pale and jumped up from the table. "No, what are you saying? I was being sincere with you. It's just that Emily asked me not to wear expensive things, so I thought I'd better present myself as a hobo, and then it was a prank. I admit it, but I didn't mean to offend you in any way. And that girl in the cafe, that was your fiancée, wasn't she? Did I guess right?" "Yes, you did. Fiancée, but ex-fiancée. She betrayed me," Jason replied in a shaky voice. Jennifer paused for a moment, as if coming to her senses. Then she said something that made the businessman uncomfortable. "Did you know that I used to own this company? I ran it until one of the business partners named Brian betrayed me. Emily was 2 years old at the time. Her husband left her, and she was diagnosed with a heart defect. I trusted Brian, and after a few bad deals, he ruined me and drove me into bankruptcy." Jason ahead in amazement. And then what happened? Gone was the firm for next to nothing. Jennifer shook her head. Gave it away, of course. What was there to do with a small child in my arms and surgery? There was compensation, of course, but it was a drop in the bucket. Anyway, I sold the firm to Brian for pennies, paid off my employees. I waved goodbye to the business. That's how it is in life. Jennifer's confession struck a nerve with Jason. If only he'd known that his father had ignorantly bought the company from a second-hand firm. Hey, what was there to talk about now? "So what are we going to do now? Are you going to take me in as your cleaning lady?" Jennifer asked ironically. Jason's cheeks flared with embarrassment. "Oh, come on. What am I not going to get you a proper job? You seem to know the ins and outs of this stuff better than I do." Jennifer just waved her hand. She didn't want to dwell on the past. "I'll do whatever you want me to do," Jennifer added. Jason smiled and promised to find her a good place. At that moment, he realized once again that fate had set him on the right path. Meanwhile, across town, Violet and Brian were discussing a plan to punish Jason Smith. "Look, why don't we take the firm away from him?" "You're good at this," Violet asked. Brian thought for a moment and then shook his head negatively. "No, that's not good enough for me. I sold this firm to his father. I can't take it back a third time. I think that's enough. Let him keep the firm, but I could put him in jail." Violet's eyes flashed with joy. Her relationship with Brian had always been special, not just because he let her do whatever she wanted. Brian hadn't been there for her in that cafe, though he hadn't felt jealous. If Brian had been with Violet, he would have known that, ironically, Jason's companion was the same deceived woman from whom he had taken the firm and sold it to Paul Smith. Violet couldn't wait to punish her ex-fiancé as quickly as possible. She kept bringing up the same question over and over again, say how long before Jason gets into trouble. "How much longer do we have to wait?" Brian smiled. "Soon, even sooner than you think. I've already put my people in his firm, recruited them, so to speak. You know, money opens a lot of doors, and when the money's good, they'll carry you home in their arms." Jason enjoyed Jennifer's company as she brought him up to speed. With her phenomenal memory, Jennifer remembered everything she had once learned on the job. It wasn't long before Brian heard a disturbing rumor that a very savvy consultant had joined Jason's firm. "I wonder who's so smart in the arena," the businessman wondered, puzzled the businessman. But when Brian found out exactly who was helping Jason, he felt uneasy. And they say you can't put a shell in the same funnel twice. That's bullshit. This is the third time you've hit the bullseye. Well, women are stupid. Jennifer's in the same hole again, Brian thought angrily, clenching his fists. With Jennifer's arrival, the firm's business had improved considerably. Of course, there were no million-dollar profits, and they could appear only after several months of fruitful labor without a single mistake and unreasonable spending. But keeping an eye on his son, Paul Smith could not help but notice changes in his company for the first time during his son's management policy. The firm's revenues began to exceed its expenses. In turn, Brian was not willing to give up so easily and wove his intrigue like the webs of a deadly spider. First, he needed to take Jennifer out of the game. But how to do that? No one knew the answer to that question. Brian thought about it for a few days, and then, slapping his forehead with the palm of his hand, said, "Why didn't I think of that before? It's so easy." It's infuriating. Violet looked hopefully at her boyfriend, realizing that he had obviously thought of something special. Brian got down to business. First, he hired a private detective to find Emily's birth father. To do this was not easy, because Michael Brown has had time to travel around the country, serving several prison sentences and bogged down in crime up to his neck. When Brian did meet with the ex-con, Michael initially refused to participate. "If I go after Jennifer, she'll put me back in jail. She'll also bring up alimony and arrears. No, I don't want to do that. She and I parted ways amicably. Jennifer keeps the girl, and I'm out of here." "I was fine with that," he said. In response, Brian laughed in the rest of his face. "You're a fool. I'll help you. You hear me? You're not going to court by yourself. You're going to court with my lawyer. Your daughter is in Paris after all. So you're entitled to all the benefits her mother enjoys, especially since she's done nothing for you all these years. So it's time for you to claim your parental rights." Michael frowned. "How am I supposed to do that? No one will let me anywhere near the court. They'll say, 'Get out of here, you fucking recidivist.'" Brian smiled. "Don't worry, I'll help you. I'll get you a good lawyer. He'll draw up a statement for you. Get the certificates. Say you're on the path of correction and want to devote more time to your family, and therefore you intend to take your daughter back. Jennifer's going to get nervous and do reckless things. Meanwhile, we're going to nail her lover from every angle. Does that sound good to you?" Michael's eyes flashed with joy. Of course, he dreamed of getting revenge on his ex all these years. He hated businessmen of all kinds and always tried to humiliate or harm them on occasion. And Michael didn't like his new partner in crime. But there was something in Brian's eyes that attracted all kinds of scoundrels to him. Brian intended to strike at the family quickly, on several fronts at once. On the one hand, he'd send a network of inspectors to Jason and his father's firm. And on the other, he'd tie Jennifer up in a legal battle. As it happens, it was at this pivotal moment that Violet learned she was pregnant. Since she led a rather turbulent life, she could not say for sure who was the biological father of her future child. After weighing the pros and cons, Violet decided to tell her father that she was pregnant with Jason's child. The girl's calculations proved correct. Not half an hour later, the furious father promised to wipe out the Smith family in the near future. When Jennifer received the summons notice, Her surprise knew no bounds. "Oh my God, what's happened? Why do they want my Emily? And who made up that petition in the first place?" It all came to light rather quickly. After seeing her ex-husband Michael Brown outside the courthouse, Jessica was stunned. He had changed and aged a lot in that time. His hands were covered in a thick network of wrinkles, and his missing teeth were replaced by dull steel crowns. "Well, hello there, dearie. You didn't expect me, did you? You've been rolling around like butter while I've been sunning myself," Michael grinned. Jennifer pressed her lips together resentfully. "And you still have the nerve to tell me that? Where have you been all these years?" "While I've been single-handedly raising Emily, running my business and finding the money to cure her. You don't know anything from there. You went along with that crook." Michael grinned. "What am I supposed to know? That you've been living here all this time?" Jennifer shook her head. Her relationship with her husband had been strained to the breaking point before, and now that they both had grievances against each other, communication seemed pointless. In court, Michael behaved the way Brian had taught him. He masterfully pressed on pity, telling the judge that he stopped with the criminal world and now intends to devote all of himself to raising his daughter. Michael's key arguments were the certificates obtained by Brian fraudulently. The cunning businessman got a few documents that Jennifer leads an immoral lifestyle, does not work anywhere, and goes to entertainment venues with dubious young men. "It's all lies." "It's not like that," Jennifer tearfully cried out. But today the court was clearly not on her side. Stepping outside, Jennifer put her face into the cool breeze and quietly cried. At that moment, Brian walked up to her and put a hand on her shoulder. "So, now do you realize who's boss? My advice to you is to drop this Smith stand aside. Then you'll be able to survive and maybe keep your daughter. And if Emily ends up in an orphanage, you'll be disenfranchised for the rest of your life." Jennifer listened and couldn't believe it. Was this really happening to her here and now? In the 21st century, when, it seemed, lawlessness no longer had the same power over people as it used to. On the other hand, she couldn't just betray Jason like that, either. When she got home, she called him and told him the truth. "I'm sorry, Jason, but I can't help you anymore." "I'm sorry, but my family is more important to me. I don't have anyone else." Jason nodded understandingly, not judging his beloved. What right did he have to do that? The next day, Jason received a three-pronged inspection from the IRS, the fire department, and even the Environmental Defense Fund. It was the first time he'd ever had to deal with something like this, and he didn't know what to do first. Paul Smith also had a hard time because his business was also under a shadow, skillfully thrown by Brian. In addition, Violet's father, who wanted revenge for his daughter's dishonor, added his own spoonful of tar. In fact, of course, Violet didn't know exactly who she was pregnant with. Despite this, she continued to blame Jason for it. The pressure was so intense that the young businessman stayed up around the clock, trying to keep not only his business, but his father's business as well. Brian felt like a lucky chess player, arranging the pieces as he saw fit. The only thing the scoundrel hadn't considered. It turned out that Jennifer, having decided to meet her ex, had already told him the whole truth. She did not forget to mention how she was looking for money for Emily's surgery, and how Brian shamelessly deceived her, taking the firm. Strangely enough, the ex-wife's story had touched a nerve with the recidivist. Of course, he knew he had betrayed his family by abandoning them to their fate. But on the other hand, letting some businessman hurt his daughter Emily. Yes, Michael knew. He'd done no better himself, but he'd redeemed himself with jail time. And this Brian guy had basically tricked him and used him for his own ends. "I'm sorry, please. I realize there's no forgiveness for me. But at least let me do one last good thing for you. I don't have long to live." Tumor in the lungs. Inoperable, Michael explained. Tears welled up in his eyes. "Michael, help me. You're my only hope." The recidivist nodded and left. 8 days after that memorable conversation with Jennifer, Michael stopped participating in Brian's scams and also made a statement in court that he deliberately slandered his ex-wife and became a hostage of other people's ambitions. The judge appreciated the recognition of the former recidivist and did not add him for this another term. That's when Brian's skillfully built front collapsed and scattered in different directions like a house of cards. Checks went out with nothing one after another, and Jason's firm had only gotten stronger, causing the stock price to skyrocket. When Violet's father saw this, he grabbed his head, but it was too late. Paul Smith would never reconcile under any circumstances. And he certainly wouldn't tell his son what to do. Realizing that he could not take Smith's business, Brian turned his attention to Violet and her father, intending to cover his own losses with the assets of their family business. The cunning con man miscalculated in small details as he acted very quickly and did not have time to analyze the situation. Greg Johnson's head of security was in his place and recognized the traitor just in time, preventing him from making a full turn. "So, did the traitor get his? Thought you could do to me what you did to that businessman you went to see?" Greg asked. After her father's words, Violet lowered her eyes guiltily, realizing that supporting Brian at this point was definitely not a good idea. Her father's bill for the damage was too much for the villain. Brian had gotten his money's worth, as the former businessman's reputation had been tarnished. He had to leave town in a hurry, where he was reviled by everyone he met. Jason and Jennifer, on the other hand, were celebrating a shared victory. It made it no less enjoyable. Emily sat next to him, looking happily at her parents. In her hurry to meet her fiancé's rich parents, Amelie stood up for the old woman. And when she crossed the threshold, Emily flew home in tears. It was raining, she was soaking wet. The smart sundress, which the girl wore in honor of the solemn occasion, clung to her body. Her hair hung in dull strands along her face. Amelie did not even think to look for shelter. On the contrary, it was even better you could not see the tears streaming down her cheeks. You'd think they were raindrops. Oberon. How could he? Those eyes of his, the timid gaze he carefully hid from her. The man Amelie had long considered the bravest, the most reliable and loving, was almost hiding behind his silent father's back. But the mother of the family was not stingy with her expressions. No, she talked a lot that evening. The target is close at hand. The outline of a large mall, which is only a 2-minute walk from the house, is already visible in the distance. Wow. It took Amelie about half an hour to get from the center. She would have waited longer for the bus, that's for sure. That's what resentment does to people. Amelie didn't even notice she'd gone about 10 or 12 kilometers. Amelie stopped. "No, you can't go home like this. Mom would be there, she'd start asking questions, worrying, and it's not good for her, even dangerous." Mom. Somewhere in Amelie's stomach an unpleasant cold ball moved. Mommy has a very bad heart. The disease progresses with age, especially lately. Mommy needs to avoid unnecessary worry. So Amelie will go to the mall now. She'll dry off a little, have a cup of coffee in the food court, sit, recover, and then put on her face one of her trademark complacent smiles, and only then will appear in front of her parents. Emily, from childhood accustomed to take care of her mother. Many times the girl witnessed her attacks. Sometimes her mother was even taken to the hospital, and not yet an adult Amelie was left for several days or even weeks alone under the supervision of neighbors, of course, but still. Amelie and her mother had no relatives to look after the girl. They were alone in the whole world. Once Amelie learned that her mom was forbidden to give birth at all. Overheard a conversation between the parent and a friend. Then the girl, of course, asked Jane's mother questions. She at first refused, tried to change her daughter's mind. And then she confessed. "Yes, they told me," she said. "They warned me. But their predictions were wrong. They didn't believe I was carrying you at all. They predicted I'd be dead by midterm. So how did you decide?" I thought, why should I live if I can't have you? You were already with me, living under my heart. How could I ever get rid of you? No, it's the best decision of my life. Amelie sometimes felt guilty, because it was because of her that her mother was in such a state. But her mother, noticing it, even got angry with her daughter. "Don't think about such things. I wanted a child myself. How could you influence my decision? Think about it. I wanted to have a daughter like that. And I'm happy I went against all odds. And I was right, by the way. Yeah, well, my heart's racing. Where's the guarantee that it wouldn't have happened without the birth? I've had it since I was a kid anyway. Doctors used to say I'd die during pregnancy. Then they said I wouldn't survive labor. Then they assured me that my child would end up in an orphanage at the age of 2 or 3. So what do we really have?" Mother often repeated Amelie that the daughter the most priceless gift that made her life. That it is a great happiness to have such a wonderful child. She also sometimes talked about Amelie's father, and the girl understood that her mother loved this man very much, although she knew him only for a short time. They met by chance, ran into each other in New York on the Brooklyn Bridge. A handsome young man had come to the Big Apple for a student conference, and his mother, then still future, of course, Amelie, had gone on vacation for the first time in her life. She had recently graduated from college, got a job as a dressmaker in an attire, and began to make a good living for those times. So she saved up for a year for a trip. Young people immediately liked each other. They walked together for a long time on the picturesque streets of New York, sat in cafes. The student turned out to be so intelligent and interesting conversationalist that the young girl listened to him, holding her breath. Then they went to his room right that same evening. Both thought that this was just the beginning of the relationship, but fate had ordered otherwise. They agreed to meet at the monument at lunchtime the day after the guy finished another semester. But the girl then never waited for her lover. At first she thought that the student deceived her, but how he looked at her with admiration, gently held her hands. No, it didn't seem to be true. The eyes could not lie. And then the girl went to the hotel where the young man was staying. There it turned out that the students were urgently taken away to some military training camp, exercises or something like that. So he just couldn't come to her. Couldn't get away. That's how we got lost. Amia's mom sighed with a sad smile as she told her daughter the story. There were no social networks then, so it was impossible to find each other in the vast country. We didn't have time to exchange addresses. I searched for him. Tried to find out information about his city or university in that very hotel. They refused. It's confidential, after all. I'm sure he tried to find me too, but at least I still had you. And how could I turn down such good fortune? Amelie took a seat at a table that was hidden behind a column. She didn't want people looking at her right now. They flowed through the upper floor of the mall in an endless stream. There were couples in love among them. Young people were hugging, smiling at each other, just like she and Oberon, who had recently been happy. But of course it was not certain that this happiness would last long. Not at all. The smiling waiter brought Amelie coffee and wished her a good day. The same friendly in appearance, but in fact indifferent. He doesn't care at all what Amelie's day will be like. It's just his job. The only person in the world who cares about the girl is her mother. Her health is deteriorating. After all, until tonight the girl had hoped that Oberon would too. Oberon loves her too. He had told her that more than once, hadn't he? He was lying. Amelie sipped the hot, fragrant drink with pleasure. A blissful warmth spread throughout her body. It even felt a little lighter. A little. Maybe it wasn't so bad after all. I'd shown my true colors today. It would have been much worse if their relationship had gone further and gotten more serious. And then he'd show her his true colors. But it couldn't get any more serious than that. Amelie thought he was about to propose to her. Why else would he suddenly ask her to meet his parents? Isn't that a sign of seriousness? Amelie was a recent college graduate. She also became a dressmaker like her mother. She loved it from a very early age. She, as a very young girl, sewed outfits for her numerous dolls. She liked to think up interesting models, select materials. The process itself also gave the girl pleasure. It is a miracle there was a piece of fabric or a few pieces. And now this shapeless something turned into a wonderful dress, which makes any doll a princess. Mom worked a lot, so the girl was often left alone at home, left to herself. But she was never bored, sewing and distracted and entertained and gave pleasure. Mom, coming from work, sincerely admired her daughter's creations. She even took these mini masterpieces Amelie in her attire and showed her colleagues. But no fashion designer from Amelie, of course, did not come out. She finished college after high school and got a profession of seamstress, and now worked in an atelier near her home. She loved her work. In her hands, everything went well. The bosses praised the young, talented employee. No one could so virtuoso as she adjust the outfit to the figure. Over time, she was entrusted with the most difficult cases, and the girl coped with them on the hurrah. She even liked difficult tasks. She saw them as a challenge. Amelie ordered herself another coffee. She needed to warm up. She didn't want to get sick and infect her mom. There was no way she could be sick. Amelie had recently done the almost impossible, arranged a consultation with a distinguished professor of cardiology. And it's completely free. Soon her mother will be examined by the best specialists in the region, and perhaps they will choose a treatment scheme that will ease the condition of a woman who is not old yet. Mom is just over 40, and yet like a 100-year-old woman she chokes when she walks, and her shelf in the bathroom cabinet is filled with batteries of medicine bottles. All of this made Amelie sick and very scared. Oberon somehow distracted the girl from these sad thoughts. A switch. By his mere existence, it was as if he lived in some other world. The son of wealthy parents, flitting through life like a carefree moth, meeting friends, traveling, partying. always smiling and cheerful. He seemed to infect others with his optimism. Oberon is also, of course, handsome, tall, athletic. Correct facial features, wide white tooth smile, charming dimples on his cheeks, and eternal bronze tan on his body. Oberon often traveled with his parents. Even in winter, they flew to the ocean, where they sunbathed and splashed in the turquoise waves. Oberon also dressed stylishly and tastefully. He looked like a guy from a fashion magazine and could easily have been a model. But he had very different plans for this life. Oberon was studying at a prestigious economics university. When he and Helene first met, the guy was just finishing his penultimate year. Ahead was a difficult but interesting year's state exams, writing a diploma, graduation, and then work for his father, a well-known local businessman, owner of a network of car services. What could be in common between this bright representative of the golden youth and a poor girl, recently graduated from college and working as a seamstress? But they had a fateful meeting in a nightclub. Emily had never been fond of such places. For one thing, it was expensive. To visit this club, she spent half of her salary, which was irrational in her situation. But Susie, her childhood friend and neighbor, had asked, literally begged Amelie to keep her company. Susie had always dreamed of a beautiful life and planned at least for one evening to plunge into the atmosphere of an expensive nightclub. She had even bought a dress for the occasion. How could Emily refuse? Amelie immediately did not like the fact that the table was occupied, and Susie immediately rushed to the dance floor. Amelie recognized her friend's silhouette among the dancing crowd and wondered, what is there to like here? The music is so loud that it seems that my eardrums are about to burst. It's stuffy, cramped, smoky. Well, since I'm here, I'll have to stay with my friend until the end. We can't leave her alone. Amelie put on her favorite tight jeans and a wide flowing top. And as it turned out, she was the one who had guessed the right outfit, not Susie in her dressy dress. Almost all the girls in the club were dressed about the same as Amelie. Not a ball at all. A couple of times she managed to get her friend out on the dance floor. "Did you come to sit here?" Susie asked, her eyes blazing with joy. And Amelie danced among the crowd of young people. Yes, it was certainly nice to relax and let the sound waves take over. At one of these moments, Oberon came up to her. He simply stood beside her and began to dance, copying and complimenting Amelie's movements. The girl, noticing this, was embarrassed, stopped, but he smiled at her in a friendly manner, took her hand and led her in the dance. Amelie spun so deftly and confidently that the two of them seemed to become one. It was an incredible sensation. During the dance, the girl looked at her unexpected beau. Handsome, incredibly handsome, stylish and dressed very expensively. Amelie had an excellent understanding of things. Because she worked in an attire, the young man was wearing clothes of expensive brands. How did such a guy even pay attention to her? Perhaps the dance would end, he would smile and leave to his equally rich friends. He probably just liked the way Amelie danced. So he paired her up for a few minutes. But Oberon didn't leave. He asked for permission to walk Amelie to her table. And since there was no one at that table, as Susie continued to conquer the dance floor, the young man offered to keep Amelie company. Wow. Amelie's heart was pounding like a jackhammer. She couldn't believe that a guy like that wanted to hang out with her. That night, they tried to talk honestly, but the loud music was getting in the way, making it almost impossible. Still, Oberon managed to shower Amelie with compliments that she had never heard from him before. "You are very beautiful and plastic. You have simply beautiful eyes." As soon as I saw them, something in me immediately turned upside down, Oberon said, looking directly at Amelie and looking very serious. The guy clearly wasn't joking or being sly. He was saying what he felt. Amelie was confused. Previously, she had only heard compliments about her undoubted talent for sewing. The girl did not consider herself beautiful. At school, the boys did not pay attention to her, noticing only the classmates with more prominent forms. What about Amelie? Skinny, tall, angular, who would look at such a thing? There were no guys at college and no guys at work. So this was the first time Amelie had ever received such delightful compliments that made her head spin. Of course, she fell in love with Oberon at once. In her mind, he was the most beautiful guy in the world, except she didn't believe anything was possible between them. Too different. Oberon asked Amelie to leave him her phone number. Amelie dictated the numbers. The young man saved her number and asked her to do the same with his. Oberon then escorted both friends in a cab home. Svetka tried to flirt with the young handsome man all the way. She, heated by drink and vivid emotions, did not immediately notice that Oberon clearly sympathized with someone other than her. The guy very delicately repelled these attacks, trying not to offend Svetka. With this, he conquered Amelie even more. What a sensitive alert. Before parting, Oberon kissed Amelie's hand. It was obvious that he wanted more to hold the girl against him, maybe even kiss her on the lips. Amelie felt it, but the boy held back and limited himself to an elegant gesture. Still, Amelie didn't believe that Oberon would call her back. The next day was a day off, and Amelie didn't have to go to work. Since the morning, she had been in suspense. On the one hand, she wanted Oberon to call. She wanted to feel the same feelings as yesterday again. On the other hand, Amelie was even a little afraid of it. What if during the day Oberon would be disappointed in her, would notice some flaw that was invisible in the light and music, would find her boring, would realize that they were not the same? See the disappointment in his eyes? That would be painful. Oberon called and said he'd pick Amelie up in an hour. He suggested a trip to the city ponds, a walk in the park, to get to know each other. He added that he couldn't think of anything else but their meeting yesterday. Amelie was very nervous about this date. She tried on all the outfits, choosing the best one, even applied light makeup, which she almost never did. Amelie wanted to hide her excitement from her mother so as not to worry her, but she noticed. Going on a date, she asked with a smile. Amelie nodded. "I'm so excited for you. I hope it's a good one. Just be careful." "Okay, don't worry, Mom. We're going to a crowded place," Amelie assured her parent. The fact that in this crowded place she would go in the car of an almost unknown guy the girl did not mention. Why bother her mom? She cannot explain and prove that Oberon is definitely a good man and will not do anything bad. Her mother had not communicated with him, had not seen his eyes, and I don't think it's possible to put it all into words. Amelie, of course, did not know much about cars, but when she saw Oberon's foreign car, she was stunned. She immediately realized that it was a very expensive model. A dark blue, glossy, streamlined car. The carriage as served Oberon smiled from the driver's seat. Amelie braced herself and got into the car. Despite the huge difference in wealth, Oberon behaved with Amelie simply and sincerely, joked with her, complimented her, asked her questions about her life and told her about himself. Gradually, Amelie relaxed. Oberon is so natural, so intelligent, so sweet. He's nothing like the Majors, the spoiled sons of rich parents. And stop living in stereotypes. All people are different. They took long walks in a beautiful park with fountains, fed the ducks, sat in outdoor cafes, laughed and talked. It feels like I finally met a kindred spirit. Oberon shared his impressions. "You're so real. I've never met anyone like you before." "What are the others like? Artificial or something?" Amelie smiled. "Exactly artificial," exclaimed the boy. "That's a very accurate word. They see in me only a purse and a pleasant appearance. With you, it's completely different." These words made Amelie's heart warm. It made her feel good to know that she was special to Oberon, not one of many. "Yes, that leaves you with nothing but sympathy," the girl joked. "I guess I've been hanging around in the wrong circles." Oberon smiled, looking warmly at his companion. Their romance resembled a fairy tale. Amelie had never dreamed of such a thing. The girl loved paperback novels, but never thought that one day she would practically be the heroine of such a read. Here's the revised text. Oberon made Amelie surprises, showered her with compliments, took her to the most interesting and unusual places in the city that she didn't even know existed. He sincerely enjoyed her reactions, surprise and admiration. "Are you so easy to please, so easy to surprise?" he sometimes said. "It's such a pleasure. I feel like a completely different person around you. I can't even express it." Oberon liked very much the sincerity of the unspoiled Amelie, and the young man often reminded her of how beautiful she was, showed photos of famous models and actresses similar to her, gave Amelie things that emphasized the advantages of her appearance. Oberon took care of Amelie. He tried to please and protect her. It was so pleasant. The girl was beginning to feel like a real princess, beautiful, fragile and loved. She had never thought of herself that way before. Of course, her mom noticed the changes happening to her daughter and knew her boyfriends. But they didn't know each other. The woman asked her daughter questions about her chosen one. When she learned that the man was very rich, she tensed up a bit. Be careful, daughter. After all, rich people choose their life partners as equals, and with the rest they just have fun and spend time, she said. What's with the stereotypes? Mom, Amelie argued. Of course, my mom doesn't understand anything. It's not like she doesn't know Oberon, doesn't see the way he looks at me. Oberon isn't like that. And anyway, it's the 21st century, and you're still suffering from some relic of the past. I just don't want him to break your heart, the woman said, shaking her head and looking anxiously at her daughter. So what's the bottom line? Did Mom turn out to be right after all? Time goes on. Nothing changes. Could it be that at first Oberon was really enchanted by Amelie? She really wasn't like his previous girlfriends. Modest, unspoiled, hardworking. No whims. Obedience and admiration. Amelie, in an effort to please Oberon, adjusting to his wishes, often agreed with his opinion, even if she herself thought otherwise. She wanted him to be happy with her. But of course there could be no future for them together. Then they were simply blinded by feelings. The girl refused to accept that fact. Amelie and Oberon were together for almost a year. The relationship between them became more and more serious. The girl could no longer live without her lover. He also wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. Only he didn't have as much time as he would have liked. Oberon was finishing his last year of university, and he often went to the sea with his parents. From warm lands, the guy invariably brought his beloved interesting jewelry, bright souvenirs, exotic outfits. The girl missed him. Someday I'll show you all this beauty. You will look very cool in a white swimsuit against the background of ocean waves, Oberon said. When I graduate, I'll announce to my friends that I have a fiancé. Really? That sounds a lot like a proposal deferred in time, but still, of course, a fiancé. Oberon nodded. And what are you against it? I thought it goes without saying that we would be married soon. Now it is true, is not the time yet, but the event is just around the corner. Amelie simply put her arms around Oberon, snuggled up against him, and closed her eyes. She felt truly happy. As such, Oberon had not proposed to her. There was no ring, no discussion of a wedding. It was simply implied from that very dialogue that they would get married sooner or later. Then Oberon got his degree. His father got him a job, as had been implied from the beginning. The boy started earning decent money. He used to be sponsored by his parents, which he never hid. Now the guy was rapidly becoming financially independent, which he was very happy about. Amelie rejoiced with him and dreamed that now he will finally make her an offer. But for several months after the defense of the diploma, the proposal did not follow. But one day Oberon said that it was time for Amelie to meet his parents because their relationship is very serious. So the family is eager to communicate with the chosen one of the only heir. Do you think it's necessary? Amelie clarified. She was very anxious about meeting Oberon's relatives. Family had always been very important to him. The girl knew it and was afraid to disappoint her parents and her beloved. Of course I will. Well, what are you worried about? Everything will be fine, answered Oberon. Amelie, as always, immediately unconditionally believed the words of Oberon because he then still seemed strong, reliable, decisive. If her lover said that everything would be all right, then it would be so. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in one of the most luxurious restaurants in the city. Amelie looked at the photos of the atmosphere of this place in social networks and began to worry even more. She always felt uncomfortable in such interiors, although Oberon periodically invited her to such places. But then it was Oberon himself, and this time she would have to interact with his parents. There was no telling how they would feel about her. On the other hand, even if her mother and father didn't like her, it wouldn't affect their relationship. He is already independent and grown up. He makes his own choices, decides everything in his life. Oberon had emphasized it many times, so Amelie's happiness was not at stake in this situation, but still wanted to please the parents of her beloved, so that in their future family reigned peace, harmony, warm relations. About the upcoming meeting, Amelie preferred not to tell her mother Helene, or she would definitely get excited, and she cannot. Recently, the health situation of Amelie's mother was getting worse. The very young woman was sick. She was often dizzy, her heart was aching. She could barely get to work, stopping at every pole to catch her breath. The doctors would throw up their hands. What do you want? You have a serious defect. They told you not to give birth. You didn't listen. The disease progressed rapidly. We are not gods and cannot work miracles, said the doctors at the hospital, where Amelie's mother went now almost every week in the hope of getting a new effective treatment. She always got the same answer. But nothing. Soon there will be a consultation with the professor, about which Amelie had agreed. This luminary of medicine will definitely help them. Amelie decided to take the trolleybus to the restaurant. She had no money left for a cab. It was still a week away from payday. The lion's share of her earnings had been spent at the beginning of the month on medicine for her mother. So what if it was a trolleybus? Amelie even liked to ride it across town and look out the window. She sometimes specially chose long routes to admire the city scenery and think about her own. But this time the girl certainly didn't manage to relax. She was constantly winding herself up with anxious thoughts. There was uneasiness in her soul. Intuition told Amelie that the meeting is unlikely to go smoothly. And as it turned out later, her instincts had not failed her. The salon was almost empty. Rush hour was long past. Amelie leaned her forehead against the cool glass and tried to calm down, but nothing worked. Maybe I shouldn't have worn this sundress. It's a nice, decent length below the knee, but the shoulders are too open. Wouldn't Oberon's parents find my outfit vulgar? Maybe I should have gone with a light business pantsuit. But I'm not going to the office, am I? Amelie's thoughts were interrupted by a squeal and a shout from the conductor. Isn't it a shame to ride public transportation as a hare at that age? The girl looked in the direction of the sound. At the far end of the cabin near the driver's seat, an ugly scene was unfolding. The conductor in an orange vest, a bearded woman with her hair highlighted with cheap dye, loomed over a dry old woman. She was huddled in her seat, clutching tightly with her hands a shabby bag full of something, and staring at the conductor in a huff. I explained to you, my dear, I'm going to my grandson's hospital, came a trembling old man's voice. I spent all my pension on a present for him. Do you understand? No. Well, what's the pity? If I drive quietly here a few stops, the cabin is still empty. And if it's full, I'll get out of this seat and stand in the corner. I won't take the seat for nothing. Whether it's empty or not is none of your business, objected the old woman. You have shown up, the conductor interrupted her. It should not concern you, but you are only supposed to pay for the ticket. Be kind and pay the required amount. If I let everyone ride for free, they would stop paying my salary. Pay up or get out. The old lady kept saying about her grandson Andrew, who was hospitalized and needs a transfer, which is carried to him by a caring grandmother. There are medicines, food, some other things. The elderly woman tried to get through to the conductor, grabbed her heart, and seemed ready to cry. But the controller remained adamant. She demanded from the elderly passenger money for the fare, otherwise offered her to leave the cabin. Amelie suddenly felt very sorry for this old woman, who was so eager to see her grandson. Maybe there really is no one else to come to the person. It's not a big deal what kind of situation people are in. The toll is not that great. Of course, Amelie was far from being rich, but she would definitely have such a sum for a good deed. The old woman's eyes were so full of despair and fear. No, Amelie simply could not, like the other few passengers, indifferently watch this scene. I'll pay for this, grandmother, Amelie said and handed the conductor some change. The conductor gave Amelie a ticket with a scornful glance at the old woman. The girl immediately handed it to her grandmother and wanted to return to her seat. But the rescued passenger grasped her hand with her dry and unexpectedly strong palm. Thank you, said the old woman fervently. Thank you for your good deeds. Don't think I'm not a beggar. I have some pension. I've worked at the factory all my life. Well, this month I'm in trouble. Grandson Andrew had an accident. I had to buy him everything. I'm taking him to the hospital, said the old lady. There's no money left at all. You give me your phone number. I'll transfer it to you when the money comes. Another surprise. It turns out that this old woman knows how to use mobile banking. A modern grandmother. No, not at all, Amelie shook her head. I won't be poor. The girl was adamant that it was a small sum for her. And the old woman, it is immediately obvious, is in a difficult financial situation. All the way to the hospital, the old woman thanked Amelie and told her about her grandson Andrew. By all accounts, he was a very decent young man. Grandma was worried about him. After the accident, he was in the hospital with injuries. But she was glad that her grandson got off relatively easy. "The wounds will heal. They won't go anywhere," said the talkative traveling companion. "The main thing is that his head is in order." Amelie nodded with a smile. And then the old woman got off at her stop, and the rest of the way the girl traveled in silence. This traveling companion distracted her a little from her anxious thoughts, relieved her excitement. But as soon as Amelie was alone, the anxiety returned. Now, sitting at a table in the cafe, drenched by the rain, Amelie mentally reprimanded herself. She should have listened to her intuition and not gone to this meeting. Now she clearly realized that nothing good could come out of it. She saw the whole situation, but a few hours ago the girl was full of hopes for a happy future together with Auburn. The luxurious atmosphere of the restaurant, of course, added to the girl's excitement. Amelie immediately saw the table where Auburn and his parents were sitting. When he noticed her, he smiled and moved towards her, embraced her, stroked her back, complimented her on her appearance. All this, of course, cheered Amelie up a little. Next to Auberon, she always had a sense of security. As it later turned out, false. Auberon's parents looked pretty much as Amelie had imagined them. Her father was an athletic, trim man with elegant gray hair on his temples, tanned, handsome. The same dimples on his cheeks as Oberon's, the same clear features. It was clear at once who the son resembled. The mother is a well-groomed woman who is, of course, a frequent visitor to beauty parlors. Smooth face with perfect skin, flawless manicure, regal posture, her gaze. The cold stare of light blue eyes. Amelie felt as if she'd been hit by an icy shower when she looked into them. Basically, at that moment, she finally understood everything on an intuitive level, but she hadn't yet realized it with her head. The hope for a favorable outcome was still alive. "Well, hello, lovely young ladies," Auberon's father said without a smile. "Hello," the girl smiled broadly. "At last we have met you." Auberon's mother stretched her lips into the semblance of a polite smile, but her eyes remained serious and cold. Everyone introduced themselves and the waiter brought the order. At first, the conversation went on about nothing. The weather. City news. Amelie periodically inserted her lines, trying to be a full participant in the conversation. After each of her remarks, Oberon's parents looked at each other meaningfully. Amelie watched their reactions carefully. And so did Oberon. He watched his parents' faces, trying to read their emotions. At that moment, the young man looked like a small child rather than an independent, attendant adult, and Amelie didn't like that very much. Then the conversation turned to Amelie herself. "Tell us a little about yourself," asked Auberon's mother. "Our son takes you very seriously. It is not every girlfriend he introduces to us. Although, of course, this is not the first time this has happened. Oberon is a man in love. Nevertheless, I'd like to know more about you." Amelie was disgusted by the "not the first time." She was clearly being insinuated that she was neither unique nor one of a kind, but one of many, and the tone of this richly groomed woman was hostile. There was a metallic note in her voice. "Well, Amelie told me." Auberon's parents asked her clarifying questions from time to time. Who was her mother? Where was her father? What does Amelie herself do for a living? What educational institution did she graduate from? The girl's answers elicited strange reactions from these people. They looked at each other, grinned. It was unpleasant. Auberon sat next to his mother and remained silent. He did not even try to somehow diffuse the atmosphere and help his girlfriend. "Why college?" Oberon's mother asked. "You probably did not do well at school. You did not get into the university." Amelie let the barb pass her ears. The lady was obviously trying to hurt her and make her emotional. She wouldn't. Amelie did well at school, even very well. She had to get a profession, get a job. The financial situation of their small family was very precarious, but she couldn't explain it all now. The conversation was becoming more and more unpleasant. The questions and remarks of Oberon's parents became more and more personal. It was as if they were turning Amelie inside out. The girl talked about herself and for some reason was ashamed of the facts of her biography, although she had never done anything bad to anyone. But Auberon's mother managed to masterfully humiliate Amelie's story about herself. The girl felt herself at this table, next to these people, a beggar and a limited dullard who did not have enough intelligence for university. A poor girl who dreamed of becoming a rich heiress and thus solving her life problems. Or maybe that's what she really was. Amelie, under the icy gaze of the unfriendly woman, suddenly realized that she had really counted on Oberon's help in treating her mother. Oberon didn't utter a word. He didn't even look at Amelie, moving closer to his father. And so it was as if the young man hid behind his mother's shoulder. He was humiliating Amelie. Oberon didn't even try to stand up for her. It was unlike him to make the girl even more confused. Oberon, he was always on her side after all, supporting her, cheering her up. But now the guy looked like a little boy, who was afraid to cause disapproval of parents. And that's when Amelie realized it all. No, there would be no future for her and Oberon together. His parents were now making that very clear to their son. Their aim wasn't even to humiliate Amelie. They were demonstrating to their only heir that a girl seamstress, living alone with her sick mother in a tiny apartment, he is not a match. And the son had learned his lesson well. Oberon will never go against his parents' wishes. He's too dependent on them. All his success and prosperity is due to his father. Amélie's feelings and her worries were completely irrelevant to these people. The girl felt like a textbook. Oberon's mother was not at all worried that such treatment could cause psychological trauma to the girl. She didn't care. The main thing was to show her son the fallacy and absurdity of his choice. Apparently, the meeting itself was conceived for that very purpose. Amélie felt tears coming to her eyes. Why should I be like this? What have I done to these people? She thought. In fact, Amélie had never done a single thing in her entire life that she could be ashamed of. The girl got up from her seat. I understand. I have to go, she said. I don't want to burst into tears in front of this family. No, I won't give them that pleasure. Amélie hurried out of the restaurant. No one tried to stop her. The girl hoped, still hoped, that Oberon would rush after her. Oh, come on. He loves me so much, after all, as he has said more than once. But Oberon stayed with his parents. Amélie burst into tears on the street. It was good that it was raining, and it was not visible to others. She didn't wait for the trolleybus, she walked. Movement always calmed her down. It was raining like a bucket. Amélie's light sundress immediately soaked through and clung to her body. Pedestrians hid under awnings to wait out the downpour. Amélie wandered down the road, not even noticing the discomfort. She wasn't in that state. Oberon. How could he do this to me? I had confidence in the man. Rejoiced that I was so lucky to meet my soulmate so early in life. Turns out I made it all up on myself, Amélie thought. Oberon was only interested in the girl as a curiosity. He was used to meeting with spoiled princesses, and here was a modest girl who had not seen anything bright and interesting in her life. Perhaps it was pleasant for him to feel like a patron, opening the world to the poor beauty. But he had no special feelings for her. Otherwise, Oberon would not have sat there like a statue while his mother humiliated a defenseless girl in front of his eyes. And now Amélie sat in the mall, sipping one cup of coffee after another. Her hair was almost completely dry and now curled beautifully. Her sundress had also become dry, and Amélie had recovered enough that she could now show herself in front of her mother. She would behave as if nothing had happened. It may be dark at heart, but her mother must not notice it. Mama must be taken care of. She's the only person in the world who truly loves Amélie, and probably always will be. Men, they're probably all like Oberon. They can get a nice buzz on your ears and then they're off when they've had their fun. Perhaps her father was the same. Perhaps her mother is hiding something from her. Or maybe she just doesn't realize that the boy she once fell madly in love with has run away from her. Amélie came home and went straight to the bathroom. Did you get caught in the rain? Asked her mother, who was lying in the bedroom holding her heart. Yes, I'm soaked through, she smiled nonchalantly. I want to take a hot shower so I don't get sick. I'll make you some tea. No, you lie down and rest. I'll do it myself, Amélie replied. In the shower, Amélie cried some more. Tears this time brought relief. The bad emotions went away with them. Amélie tried very hard to behave as if nothing had happened. But her mother noticed the change in her daughter. It was impossible to hide anything from her attentive gaze. Have you quarreled with your Oberon? Mama asked. How did you realize it? Amelie was surprised. First of all, you don't go out anymore. It's hard not to notice. And secondly, your eyes have been very sad lately. We broke up, Amelie nodded. He turned out to be a regular mama's boy. It's a good thing I caught it in time. He didn't hurt you. No, not at all. I just saw that he was a mama's boy. I don't want to be around that kind of guy. Yeah, well, I was upset, of course, disappointed. But it's okay now. That Oberon I fell in love with, he didn't even exist, you know. I just made him up. That's what I'm sad about. But I'll be smarter from now on. Amelie smiled broadly, showing her mother that she was doing well. Although, of course, the girl was still in pain. Her dreams of a happy life next to the man she loved had been shattered. Amelie still longingly remembered that former Oberon, who existed in her imagination before that meeting in the restaurant. She thought she had met the perfect man, and then suddenly it turned out that such a man probably didn't exist at all. It hurt so much. Oberon's parents, especially his mother, had humiliated her, not hesitating to express themselves and not caring a bit about her feelings. If Oberon had at least tried to protect his girlfriend, to support her, Amelie wouldn't feel so devastated now. But alas. Amelie tried to live her old life, working, going out with her friends, reading a lot to distract herself. She was now constantly cleaning the apartment. The house shone with cleanliness, but the soul did not become clear and clean. And then there was that long-awaited appointment with Professor Walshian. We went to the clinic with my mother. The professor turned out to be a tall, thin old man with shrewd blue eyes. He carefully familiarized himself with the history of the heavy patient. He did not say anything, but ordered some additional tests. All the necessary procedures were carried out in the same clinic quickly, promptly, without cues. The professor himself took Amelie's mother around the rooms. The girl rejoiced, wow, what an attentive attitude. In the local clinic, this was not even close. As it turned out, the professor was in a hurry for a reason. He, as an experienced physician, immediately realized that the case is bad. The situation is critical. After all the examinations, the trio returned to the office. The professor was ready to pronounce his verdict. Well, I have nothing to please you, he waved his hands. I can't even believe that this is the result of the examination of such a young woman. The heart is worn out. It barely works. Medication won't help. We have to operate. Amelie clutched her mother's hand, who was listening attentively to the doctor's every word while remaining calm. The operation should have been done a long time ago. I don't understand how your doctor could let the situation get so bad. The professor sounded clearly annoyed. You can even try to sue him. But that's after. Now the main thing is the operation. And then the professor told the details of the upcoming operation. It was complicated, very complicated. Not every cardiac surgeon would do it for a patient in this condition. It is necessary treatment in New York, and this is travel, accommodation, payment of expensive medicines. And the operation itself cost a fabulous amount of money. When the professor announced the amount, Amelie shuddered. She and her mother simply have nowhere to get such a sum, except to sell the apartment and to be on the street. But even so, still real estate so quickly cannot be realized, and we need the money now. It must be done as soon as possible, said the professor, seriously looking at the confused visitors. Literally every day counts. What will happen if we don't operate? Amie's mother asked. I just can't imagine where to get such a sum of money. Is drug therapy possible? No, the doctor answered immediately. No medication will help you, only surgery. What are we going to do? Amelie whispered. She could hardly fight the tears that were coming to her eyes. All the previous worries about disappointment in Auburn suddenly seemed to her a complete nonsense. Here it was, the real trouble. And what to do about it, I don't know. Try to apply to a charitable foundation, advised the professor. They open collections for treatment. They help many people. The doctor ran his fingers over the keyboard in search of the necessary folder. He found what he was looking for and printed out a sheet with a list of charitable foundations. We'll find the money. We'll make it work, Amelie told her mother in a confident tone. Every free minute the girl now monitored vacancies. She was ready for anything to go on shift to the north, to respond to dubious advertisements offering obviously illegal activities for relatively good money. But the girl quickly realized that this was not the way out either. Until she gets a job, until she works for a couple of months to be able to apply for a loan, precious time will be lost. And she would not get into trouble herself, not to run into scammers. Most of the ads that promise golden mountains look too suspicious. And if something happens to her, how will mom survive it? Who would help her? Amelie was desperate. She sobbed every day out of helplessness, secretly from her mother. She, on the other hand, seemed surprisingly calm. She seemed to accept her fate and did not even try to do anything, realizing that it was useless. One day Amelie took the desperate step of turning to someone who had no one else to turn to. So she dialed Oberon. Yes, they hadn't communicated all this time. Oberon hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't even tried to apologize for his behavior at the restaurant. It seemed that he was quite satisfied with the fact that Amelie herself evaporated from his life less problems, a mountain off his shoulders. After everything that had happened, the girl despised Oberon, considered him a mama's boy. Even his very name irritated her. She deleted all the photos of them together, so that she wouldn't accidentally stumble upon them in her phone. Those pictures hurt her over and over again. She was so happy in them, so in love. And she had no idea what lay ahead of her. But anyway, only Oberon could help her. He's wealthy, he doesn't count money. Perhaps he would lend her the necessary amount, even with interest, just to get the money for her mother's operation as soon as possible. Amelie will never get such a loan, her solvency is too low, but she will try to work wherever she can, as soon as possible to pay off the debt. Amelie is not afraid of work. Here's a list of funds that really help. Not scams, he said. Amelie grasped the list like a drowning man grasping at straws. On the way home, mother and daughter were silent. Each was thinking about something else. The woman was making a difficult choice for herself to fight or leave everything as it was, because the forces in this battle were too unequal. Amelie was frantically searching for a way out. She saw no other way but to fight for her mother's life to the last. When she got home, the first thing the girl did was to call every charity on the list. Amelie hoped they would help. She was sure of it, but no one wanted to help. Amelie got different answers to her appeal. Someone immediately said that they specialize only in sick children, as if adults do not get into difficult situations or less want to live. There were also inexplicable refusals without a clear explanation of the reasons. And only in one place Amelie was explained the essence. You see, the woman who answered the phone explained in a guilty voice, "Your situation is not too spectacular. Everyone feels sorry for little children and transfers money to them. Well, they also help fathers and mothers of the kids, so that the kids don't remain orphans, especially mothers. You have a woman, your mom, an adult, working. Her daughter's all grown up. So no one's going to the orphanage, if anything. There's almost no chance that they will respond to the request." Amelie was grateful to her interlocutor for this hard, but the truth. At least now it is clear why all the foundations refuse them. It means that it is necessary to look for other ways out of the difficult situation. Relying on funds is only a waste of time. "Let's put the apartment for sale," suggested the girl. "Cheaper, so that sooner a buyer will be found." "What are you?" sighed the woman. "The operation, it is not known whether it will help or not. And you, if anything, without your corner will be left. And how will you live?" "No, let things go as they are." "No?" Amelie exclaimed. "No, don't even think about it." Aliena felt the prospect of losing her mother frighten her to the point of convulsion. Sure, it wasn't easy to dial Oberon's number, but it was for her mother's sake. If it hadn't been for her illness, Amelie would certainly never have contacted her failed fiancé. Oberon answered at once. His voice sounded a little surprised, but there was no guilt or remorse in it. Oberon spoke to Amelie as if nothing had happened, as if a former classmate had suddenly called him. "Hello, how are you?" the guy asked politely. "Not so good," Amelie admitted. "I hope you're not going to start telling me about your upset feelings now. I just don't like that kind of thing. What was is what was. It's over and done with. We move on." "It's not about upset feelings," Amelie sighed. "You see, my mom, she's very sick. I told you, remember? Her heart." "I remember something like that." "So what's the next step?" "Well, the next thing is she needs surgery or she's going to die." "I'm sorry. It's sad." I hope she's going to be okay. The problem is, it's not free. It costs a lot of money. We don't have that kind of money, and there's nowhere to get it. I see Oberon grinned. Wow. My mother is a visionary. She warned me that this would happen, didn't she, Amelie? Well, she said that once the fish was off the hook, you'd try to get your money another way. True. Mom thought it would be a heartbreaking story about your own illness or the news of your sudden pregnancy. But you brought your mother into it. Amelie was taken aback. Did Oberon really think she was just trying to screw him for money? Had he learned nothing about her during the time they'd been dating? How could Oberon say something like that? It's hurtful, painful, hard. Unfair reproaches and accusations of mercantilism hurt her soul. But Amelie pulled herself together. She can't show weakness now, she can't take offense. Oberon is her last hope. Look, Oberon, it's all true, she began in a persuasive tone. I can show you the certificates, the professor's conclusions, the price list of the clinic, Amelie said convincingly. It's all easy to make up, isn't it? The boy bent his mind. The professor will call you himself. I'll ask him. Hey, you're kidding me. Yeah, that call could be made by anyone. You got a sucker. Oberon, but it's true. I can prove it. Besides, I'm not just asking for a huge sum of money. I'll pay it back. I'll pay it all back. I'll write you an IOU. I'll pay you the interest and the debt. My main thing is to pay for the operation as soon as possible. They won't give me a loan. My official salary is too small. Then how are you going to pay back the debt? You said yourself you can't afford the loan. I'll work day and night, I'll work hard. But I need the money urgently right now. That's a heartbreaking story, grinned Oberon. It's a pity such talent is wasted. You could write novels easily, couldn't you? I'm sick of it, the boy said sharply. I'm sick of listening to this nonsense. And at first I still felt guilty that everything turned out this way. You seemed to me a naive and sincere girl, and now I see that my mother was right. She accurately predicted your behavior. That's it. Don't call me again. The phone rang with short beeps. Amelie dialed Oberon's number again and again. She just couldn't convey to him the seriousness of the situation. She should explain it better. He would understand. But Oberon seemed to have blocked her number. That's all. Her last hope evaporated like dew on a hot summer's day. Amelie had no idea who else to turn to. Oberon had trampled and humiliated her again. He's made it clear that he thinks her ex is a fraud. He won't even talk to her. How could he? Tears spurted from the girl's eyes. She couldn't, and didn't want to hold them back. How often had she been crying lately? Amelie was outside, right at the bus stop. Good thing there were no other people around, but what did it matter? Amelie slumped helplessly on the bench, wrapping her arms around herself. She shuddered, her whole body shaking violently. Amelie could do nothing about the condition. It must have been hysteria. She was tired of fighting, tired of knocking on every door and getting rejected everywhere. And then there was Oberon. She had to turn to the man who had once trampled and humiliated her. And he did it again. But most importantly, Amelie was never able to help her mother. Seeing life slowly leaving a loved one day by day was unbearable. Her mother was weakening before her eyes. She didn't even go to work anymore, sitting on endless sick leave. The boss threatened to fire the woman. Who needs such an employee? And what a job. Amelie's mother could hardly move around the house, and she was still so young. And Amelie, a grown-up daughter, can't help her own mother. If it wasn't for her, Mom would be feeling much better now. Vaughn and the professor also said that pregnancy and childbirth finally undermined the woman's health. Large tears ran down the girl's cheeks, and her sobs made it hard to breathe. Amelie could not pull herself together, and then a car stopped right in front of her. It stopped and stopped. No big deal. Maybe it was just a ride to the stop. It happens. Amelie tried her best to calm down so as not to scare people. Yes, somewhere the glass opposite the driver's seat slowly rolled down. Amelie met her gaze with attentive gray eyes. It was a young man, a little older than she looked. He was looking at the girl with undisguised interest. She kept sobbing, unable to calm down. And I told you there was something wrong with her. I noticed it from afar came an elderly voice from the back seat. The man turned to the invisible passenger and nodded absent-mindedly, then turned to Amelie. Young lady, what's wrong with you? Do you need help? No, Amelie objected. She suddenly felt ashamed that she was sitting there crying in front of everyone. People were stopping because of her. Amelie couldn't help it. It must have been hysteria. She was tired of fighting, tired of knocking on every door and getting rejected. And then there was Oberon. She had to turn to the man who had once trampled and humiliated her. And he did it again. But most importantly, Amelie was never able to help her mother. Seeing life slowly leaving a loved one day by day was unbearable. Her mother was weakening before her eyes. She didn't even go to work anymore, sitting on endless sick leave. The boss threatened to fire the woman. Who needs such an employee? And what a job. Amelie's mother could hardly move around the house. And she was still so young. And Amelie, a grown-up daughter, can't help her own mother. If it wasn't for her, Mom would be feeling much better now. Vaughn. And the professor also said that pregnancy and childbirth finally undermined the woman's health. Large tears ran down the girl's cheeks, and her sobs made it hard to breathe. Amelie could not pull herself together, and then a car stopped right in front of her. Yes, somewhere the glass opposite the driver's seat slowly slid down. Amelie met the gray, attentive eyes. It was a young man, a little older than she looked. He was looking at the girl with undisguised interest. She kept sobbing, unable to calm down. And I told you there was something wrong with her. I noticed it from afar came an elderly voice from the back seat. The man turned to the invisible passenger and nodded absent-mindedly, then turned to Amelie. Young lady, what's wrong with you? Do you need help? No, Amelie objected. She suddenly felt ashamed that she was sitting there crying in front of everyone. People had stopped because of her. They were going somewhere on their own. Maybe they were in a hurry, the man continued. No, don't be embarrassed if someone has offended you or something has happened. Then the back door of the car opened and an old woman stepped out. A light pantsuit, gray hair arranged in an elegant bundle. This old woman bore little resemblance to the old lady in the handkerchief on the trolleybus who couldn't find the fare, and yet it was her. Amelie recognized her. What a coincidence, smiled the old woman. It's not a small town. What were the chances of them meeting again? And yet they did. Agatha, I know you, the old woman smiled warmly. Andrew, this is the girl from the trolleybus. Remember, I told you who paid for me when I went to your hospital. The man got out of the car too. Now both grandmother and grandson stood in front of Amelie, whose tears had dried from surprise. Of course I remember this story. The young man smiled at his grandmother, and then looked at Amelie. Imagine I was in a minor traffic accident. I was taken to the hospital overnight just to observe. I didn't even want to tell my grandmother. It's just that a friend of hers works there as a nurse, so I blabbed. Well, and Grandma dropped all her affairs, bought on the remnants of the pension to me food and medicine for a year ahead and rushed to the hospital, said Andrew with a slight irony. Here you are again ironizing. The old woman looked reproachfully at her adult grandson. But you'll understand me when you raise a child from infancy and put your soul into it. Then we'll talk about unnecessary worries and anxieties. Amelie was pleased to watch this friendly altercation. Kind, caring, sensitive people who obviously love each other very much. And for some reason I thought on the trolleybus that your grandson was a boy, or a teenager, Helene confessed. For me, he is always small, even though he is already under 2 meters tall, and has long provided for himself, smiled the old lady. What's the trouble with you? She turned to Amelie. Honey, you do not be shy, tell me. You're a kind girl. You help me then. You are not indifferent. Maybe we can do something to help you. Amelie sighed. How could these people help her? She was faced with unsolvable problems, too difficult for her. And no one in the whole world could help her. Nevertheless, the girl suddenly realized that she really wanted to share her trouble with someone. Andrew and his grandmother will listen to her, that's for sure. And at least sympathize, pity. Amélie suddenly realized that all the time she had been hiding her worries from others. Even with her mother, she could not share her innermost feelings, because she had a heart condition, and she should not worry. And here they are, potential listeners, sitting next to each other, asking to open their souls. And that's exactly what Amélie needs right now. "So how will you finally tell me what happened to you?" the old lady asked again. "And you do not hurry," said Amélie. "My story is not too short." "We are in no hurry," the grandmother and grandson said together. "All right," Amélie nodded her head. "But I suggest that we settle somewhere nicer," said Andrew, looking around. "There seems to be a nice pizzeria over there. How about it?" "I'm in," immediately responded the old woman. "Me too," Amélie nodded, frantically trying to figure out how much money she had left on her card. Cozy atmosphere, stylish furniture, pleasant music. The interior of the pizzeria was conducive to conversation. Andrew, despite Amelie's objections, paid for the order himself. The company settled down at a table, hidden behind racks of fresh flowers. "Now tell us about your trouble," the old woman smiled, "and we'll think together how to help you." "Good," Amélie nodded, still puzzled as to why these people would listen to her, let alone help her. "So what if she paid for an old lady on the trolleybus? It's nothing, it's not worth discussing. But if they asked for it?" Amélie told them everything about her life alone with her mother in a tiny apartment, about the constant feeling of guilt for the illness of the dearest person, about the fear for the life and health of her mother, which she had experienced since a very young age. The girl mentioned Auberine as well, saying that it was to meet his parents that she rode that day on the trolleybus. Details of the behavior of the mother and father of the beloved did not report, limited only to the phrase that they made it clear that she was not a match for their son, and said that after that she broke up with her fiancé. This story did not have much to do with the case, but Amélie did not hold back. The parting with Auberine still tormented her. The girl did not tell anyone about her feelings and worries, and now suddenly there were attentive listeners. She shared with them what was still weighing on her soul, her disappointment in her beloved man. "Rotten people." The old woman made a verdict. "Not a good thing. Nothing good in their lives. They will not choose a wife for their grown-up son on a suitable lady. There will be no agreement between them. We've been there, we know. There are many such examples before our eyes. Life will not once again punish in your willful Auberine and his parents." Andrew said nothing. He looked at Amélie with such sympathy, with such participation that words were not needed. The girl felt the man's support and approval. It was a pleasant feeling. Then it was the turn of the story about her mother again. Amélie told about the reception at the famous professor and his verdict. And now her mother needed an expensive operation, and it was urgent. "I tried to find the money," Amélie continued. "I did everything I could. I even went to a colleague, but he thought I was a fraud. That's why I cried at the bus stop after talking to him." "What a fool," exclaimed the old woman in heart. "He doesn't understand people at all. I see you for the second time in my life, and I realize that you are a very honest and modest girl." Amélie continued. "And he's been seeing me for so long, and he hasn't realized anything." Auberine, whom this old woman didn't even know about, annoyed her a lot. It seemed funny if it weren't for the tragic nature of the situation. "Well, I can't get any money," Amélie summarized. "Without an operation. Mom. Mom." The girl still could not pronounce the terrible word, but the listeners already understood everything. The old woman put her arm around Amélie's shoulders and stroked her head. Amélie cried again. "But I can't help these silly tears," she continued. "I can't help it. It's the first time I've been listened to. It's the first time I've been sympathized with. That's worth a lot, but the trouble hasn't gone away. And the problems haven't just evaporated. Money didn't materialize out of thin air." The old woman soothed Amélie, whispering some comforting words that really did make her feel better. Andrew silently looked at this picture and clearly thought something. "How much money are we talking about?" finally asked the man. Amélie said the figures that made her panic. Andrew raised his eyebrows in surprise. "What did you think, grandson?" sighed the old woman. "These are the prices we have now." An ordinary person cannot get sick. And what, free of charge, this operation cannot be done? Asked Andrew. You can, replied Amelie, which has already managed to cope with emotions not without the participation of a kind old lady. For free you can wait in line for almost a year. Mom does not have that much time. Well, I am ready to give such an amount for treatment, said Andrew. Grandma looked at her grandson with pride and approval. Ellen gawked her eyes in surprise. Andrew can give her such a sum. But he doesn't look like such a rich man at all. Dressed well, but not flashy. His car is nice, but not high-end like Oberon's. And anyway, how can you accept such a gift from a complete stranger? Amie's mind was buzzing. Well, how can she think about such details when her mom is slowly fading away without surgery? And lo and behold, still worried, anxious. Here is my edited version of the text. Amelie said cautiously, I'm afraid I can't accept such a sum. It doesn't seem right. Everything is right and fair, assured the old lady. You helped me in a difficult situation, and now Andrew is helping you. Boomerang, you've heard of it? The amounts are quite different. Amelie did not give up. So? The old lady didn't give up. Who has what opportunities? Do not worry. Andrew smiled and covered Amelie's hand with his warm palm. A friendly, soothing gesture that made the girl feel lighter in her soul. I do have such an opportunity. What's more, I spend a certain amount every year on charity. It's an ironclad rule. Amelie did not understand anything at all. If this Andrew is so rich, then why his grandmother did not have money for travel? Andrew, I have a good boy. He is a successful businessman, proudly declared the old lady. I raised him from a diaper. When his parents died, he was just a baby. I am not his own grandmother, even just a lonely neighbor. I couldn't bear the fact that my nice neighbor's child would end up in an orphanage. So I took him in, raised him like her own grandchild. And he was smart from a small age, serious beyond his years. I knew right away that the boy would go far. And he did. Grandma does not miss a moment to brag about me, smiled Andrew. But she's right. I really managed to build a business that brings a stable income. We make furniture to order. We already have many branches, and not only in our city. There's even a branch in Miami. In Los Angeles, corrected the old lady, looking adoringly at her grandson. Every year I spend a certain amount of money for charity. This year it should be your mom's. All the more, it seems that fate itself had arranged this meeting. What were the odds of bumping into you at the exact moment when you were sobbing with despair and helplessness at the bus stop? There's no such thing as coincidence. So, can you really give us that kind of money? Ellen still couldn't believe his happiness. But I can't just take it, said Amelie. Let it be a receipt. I'll pay it back slowly. I'll pay it all back. Oh, you're so stubborn. The old woman threw up her hands. I understand that you are embarrassed, shook his head Andrew, looking carefully at Amelie. I know people. He does, the grandmother confirmed her grandson's words. In business, otherwise it is impossible. Let's do it this way. I have long wanted to invest in some new enterprise. We'll register an LLC for you. An atelier that makes custom-made clothes. From what I understand from your story, you're a talented dressmaker. The amount for your mom's treatment will be part of the investment in the company. And then, when this enterprise will begin to bring income, and it will definitely happen, I'm the one who knows about such things. You will gradually and give me this money as part of the profit due to the investor. I hope I've made myself clear? Amelie nodded. What was happening was more and more like a fairy tale. The investment, the firm, the new interesting job, and most importantly, the money for her mom's surgery. Was this really happening in reality? Amelie was suddenly afraid that now she would wake up and it would turn out that she just saw a wonderful dream. But no, everything turned out to be true. Andrew and Amelie exchanged phone numbers. And his grandmother took Amelie's number too. Call me when you're feeling down, the old lady said. Don't disappear. You're a very nice person. It's interesting to talk to you. And somehow it all spun up quickly. Amelie's life was changing from day to day. These changes even made her a little dizzy. First, Amélie's mom was sent to Chicago for surgery. Andrew not only paid for the necessary medical procedures, but also organized everything down to the last detail. He bought the tickets, arranged for rent for Amélie in Chicago, arranged a comfortable room for her mother, found all the rare drugs on the list. Amélie couldn't have done it on her own, especially not so fast. Andrew solved all problems as if at the snap of his fingers. He was an amazing man, Andrew. He didn't talk a lot, only business. Unlike his grandmother, he turned out to be a rather silent man. Often Andrew and Amélie would drive together on business, and both would be silent. Just silence. It wasn't oppressive, it wasn't uncomfortable. The girl felt waves of warmth and acceptance coming from Andrew. She was perfectly aware that she was falling in love with him. Of course he was the perfect man. Except that the girl, every time she had such thoughts, restrained herself. Andrew. He probably has a soulmate. The man is not married. There is no wedding ring on his finger, but of course he is not free. Of course his chosen one is also ideal, some beauty of model appearance, with a pure soul and impeccable manners. Where can I get to such a one? She thought. So Amélie only had to dream from time to time that one day Andrew will pay attention to her as a girl. Only these dreams seemed to be unfulfilled. For 2 weeks, while her mother was recovering in the hospital after a serious operation, Amélie spent in Chicago. Every day she visited her parents, brought her treats, cheered up her mom. The doctor said the surgery was a success, and added that the patient had managed to jump on the last carriage of the departing train. Just a little bit more, and, in short, Andrew and his grandmother met just in time. Andrew's grandmother was always in touch. She asked Amélie about her mother's health, rejoiced together with the girl obvious improvements. She also told her what places to visit in her free time in Chicago, wherever Amélie had been during that time. She had seen everything. It was very exciting, as the girl had never been in Chicago before. Andrew also often called, but the nature of conversations with him was rather businesslike. The man was engaged in registration of a new LLC of the firm, the director and chief master of which was to become Amélie. This slightly worried the girl. Will she be able to cope? She was perfectly capable of inventing new models and sewing. This is her real vocation. It was great that she would finally have the opportunity to earn money doing something she really liked, something that inspired her. The girl had long felt that she was burying her talent in the ground, working in an attire as a simple dressmaker. Fitting things to the figure, it's quite different from sewing outfits to order. That's where the imagination runs wild. But now you have to get into the paperwork. Amélie will be the director and co-owner of the firm. She'll be fine. The main thing is that Mom was saved. Now Amélie will do everything to make the firm flourish, and Andrew did not regret his decision. She will give him the entire amount, even more. As time passed, Mom got stronger and was discharged. Mother and daughter returned home, full of plans and hopes for a new life. Mom went back to work. Now she didn't need to take sick day after sick day. She looked like a young, healthy, energetic woman again. Amélie, on the other hand, had plunged headlong into her new firm. The work was addictive, inspiring, and joyful. The girl could not be happy with what she was doing now. Andrew helped her with documents and legal issues. He did not even need to ask. He was like some kind of inner instinct, felt when and where there are problems, and solved them easily and playfully, as he always did. Amélie struggled with herself, trying not to betray her feelings for Andrew. He saved her in a difficult and seemingly hopeless situation. Of course, the role of savior, and caused in Amélie romantic feelings. But did Andrew need it? Hardly. He is just a good man who could not pass by the offended Amélie, giving money at the bus stop, thought the girl. Especially since he had the means to help her. And he's also a businessman who decided to try a new project in a tire where they sew custom-made clothes. This is a potential source of good profit. That's why the man got involved. That's all. Andrew was serious, silent, even a little sullen. Looking at him, it was hard to imagine how kind and sensitive he was. With his subordinates, he spoke sometimes harshly and aloofly, especially not getting close to anyone. One day he told Amélie about his life. It happened one evening, when they sat up late for a report. Andrew had lost his parents at an early age in a fire in the wooden house where they all lived together. The fire had started. A vigilant neighbor, the same old lady from the bus, called the fire department in time. They arrived quickly, but the wooden building burst into flames like a matchbox. By the time they arrived, it had burned to the ground. Andrew was lucky, then his mother put him to sleep in a stroller in the yard in the fresh air. Meanwhile, she herself was doing things in the kitchen, which was immediately cut off from the exit by fire. Father was repairing the attic and didn't get out either. The house was old. The wiring should have been replaced a long time ago, and the windows had bars left by the previous owners. Andrew's parents were trapped, but he himself was unharmed. The boy was taken in by the very neighbor who raised the alarm. She loved Andrew's parents. More than once she told the boy that they were very good and hard-working guys. Both from orphanages, both smart and focused on success. They would have achieved a lot in life, if not for the damn fire, complained sometimes guardian Andrew. You have to live for 3 and realize all the plans and hopes of your parents. And Andrew tried very hard to be the kind of man that his mother and father would be proud of. He always studied well. Study was given to him easily. There was time for walks and for extra classes. The boy early demonstrated that his hands grow from where they should. Even in childhood, Andrew himself learned to make simple furniture. And when he was only 11 years old, he and a couple of friends went to the bypass road to sell what he had made himself. The chairs and tables quickly sold out. People bought simple furniture for the garden, for the cottage. Andrew then even received the first orders. Slowly, little by little, established his business. Andrew opened his own production. By the end of school, he already had his own company with hired workers, regular suppliers, and buyers. Everything as it should be, but unofficially, because Andrew remained a minor. But the money he got quite real. Then the guy easily entered the local economic university. He specifically chose such a direction to know how to properly and officially conduct their business. Well, at one point I decided to legalize my mini firm, smiled Andrew, remembering those times. It worked. Furthermore, we grew, developed, opened branches, and now I own my own mini empire. After this story, Amelia had even more respect for Andrew. What a man. He himself rose from the bottom, went all the way from homemade furniture to a network of furniture production. That's great. Amelia's feelings for Andrew did not fade. On the contrary, they flared up day by day. Outwardly calm and even stern Andrew. No one knew how kind and considerate he really is. Lucky his girlfriend Emily thought. I wonder what she is like. And how does she feel about the fact that her beloved literally disappears 24 hours a day at work? That his furniture mini empire is engaged in his new project at Tyre. Amelie gradually became a keen businesswoman. Now she understood a lot of things, and almost all issues were solved by herself without the help of Andrew. The girl even realized her long-standing dream of driving. She passed the license and bought a new car in the salon. Not expensive foreign car, but quite a good and reliable car. Ami was a very careful driver, but unfortunately not everything depends on a single road user. Racers and daredevils are not cancelled. There are plenty of them everywhere. One day Amelie was caught up with such a rule breaker. It happened right at an intersection. The airbag didn't deploy for some reason. Amelie hit her head on the steering wheel, no harm done, but she cut her forehead. An ambulance arrived at the scene and took her to the city hospital. She needed a few stitches. Amelie sat in the treatment room while the doctor worked on her forehead. The girl did not feel any pain. All she could think about was how badly her favorite car had been damaged. When the wrecker was taking the car away, Amelie didn't have time to see the damage, but it was obviously more serious than her own small injury. After the doctor finished his work, the girl was lifted into the room. Can I go now? I just have a lot to do at work today. I feel fine, she turned to the doctor. No, the doctor shook his head. You'll have to spend 24 hours in the hospital. We have to rule out a concussion. Amelie was frankly bored in her single room. She didn't intend to go to the hospital, so she hadn't even brought a book. At least she could read now. And so there was only the phone. The girl told her mom that she was spending the night at a friend's house. She didn't tell her about the accident. Amelie was used to protect her mother from stress, although her mother's health now did not cause any concern. Amelie lay on the bed, leafing through the news feed, when the door of the room rattled open. Standing on the threshold was Andrew, his hair disheveled, anxiety in his eyes. Seeing Amelie staring at him in surprise from the bed, he jumped up to her and hugged her tightly. "I was so afraid of losing you." Warmth went through the girl's body from these sincere words of Andrew. He cared about her. Wow. Amelie pressed herself against him with pleasure. She had been dreaming about this for so long. "I was afraid that there was something serious with you." Andrew pulled back a little and looked into the girl's eyes. "Video in the local Publix, your mangled car. Got the license plate. It says the driver was taken to the hospital in serious condition. I don't think I could not without you." "I'm fine," Amelie smiled. "It was exaggerated on purpose to make it more interesting for people to read. It's just a scratch on my forehead. The doctor put in a couple of stitches. That's nothing." Andrew smiled back. "Well, now it seems there's no point in hiding it," he said. "I didn't tell you anything, because you were, well, kind of dependent on me. I didn't want to embarrass you," Andrew admitted. "I myself do not know at what point I have feelings for you. Maybe when you told us about your trouble at the pizzeria? Or maybe when we organized your mother's treatment together with Auburn. I don't know, but I've never met anyone so sincere, honest, and beautiful. Today, when I heard about the accident, I was so afraid I'd lost you forever. It's such a fear. I've never experienced that before." Amelie smiled. She will find the words to tell Andrew how she feels, but a little later. Surely he himself can see everything in her eyes. Andrew is smart, and he has a keen sense of people. "Well, now you are in the same situation as your grandmother once," Amelie smiled. "Remember, she said at the bus stop that someday you would understand her, that you would realize how scared you were for your loved ones. And that's what happened." And it's true, and Andrew's eyes lit up a cheerful light. The situation is very similar. Grandma, as always, was right, and so in everything. A teacher rescued an orphan boy, and a short time later found herself on the street. Pete leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He stayed late at the office, reviewing reports on the financial status of his restaurants. He had a whole chain of them now. The numbers were encouraging. Business was booming, not without problems, of course. Often there were various incidents that had to be regulated and cleaned up. That's business, but in general the restaurants flourished, which of course could not help but encourage. Who'd have thought it? Years ago, Pete was starving, dreaming of a portion of fries and a patty, a piece of chocolate cake, a glass of milkshake with foam. And now he's feeding half the town on his own. Yeah, life's a director. Pete's really rich now, big business, bank accounts. He can afford to travel anywhere in the world, expensive cars, clothes from famous designers. True, here are the trappings of a luxurious life. All this tinsel is not for him. Most importantly, the man now does not need help, he helps himself. It is so nice to be able to make someone a little happier. Pete regularly transfers money to foundations that raise money for the treatment of people, and of course sponsors several orphanages. Most of these institutions are located in New York, where Pete has been living for more than 20 years. The man does not ignore the orphanage in Sandersville. Sandersville is a small provincial town. Dusty streets with broken sidewalks, weedy squares overgrown with weeds. It's a place of desolation and tranquility. It's where Pete spent his childhood. The man often reminisces about his early years, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Pictures from the past sometimes rise up before his eyes by themselves. Pete doesn't chase these memories away. On the contrary, he likes to think about the fact that he was able to get out of the pit, to stand, to survive, to become strong. In addition, his own story does not let him forget that there are many boys and girls in the world who need support and attention. His children's son and daughter are already old enough to talk to them about serious things. Andrew is in the 8th grade. Jessica is a year younger. Pete has long since told them about his life. At their age, he had a hard time. Children need to know that the world is not equally fair and kind to everyone. Both Andrew and Jessica are lucky. Everything comes easy to them, so to speak, by birthright. But that doesn't mean that others are doing the same. Son and daughter are well aware of how many disadvantaged children in the world and empathize with these people. That especially pleases their father. Andrew sometimes travels to orphanages together with Pete. They see everything, know everything, and even created their own group and social networks to help orphaned children. They collect clothes, toys. Good guys. Pete was afraid that he would spoil his heirs too much, and he didn't want his son and daughter to turn into soulless snobs. Such a fate often awaited the children of wealthy parents. Pete had seen enough of such offspring. Permissiveness, indifference to other people's misfortune, confidence that the world revolves only around them. It's a sight to behold. Pete did his best to make Andrew and Jessica grow up sensitive, empathetic, attentive. And he was succeeding. They were doing it. His wife, Esmeralda, supported him in everything he did. They've known each other for years, almost a lifetime. Esmeralda also grew up in an orphanage. The girl was abandoned in the maternity hospital after she was born. Quiet, shy, unrequited. Just like Pete. She'd long been the butt of local leaders' jokes, a punching bag. A person to assert herself, take out her frustrations on. Pete was the same way. He tried not to run into the guys, lived in constant fear, flinched at every rustle or loud sound. He had become strong for her sake, for Esmeralda's sake. He could not stand up for himself, but it was also unbearable to see this girl, who was quiet in her big eyes, being insulted. They became friends with Esmeralda. At first they played together, discussed some problems and worries. Both of them had no one to share their joys and sorrows with, but in each other they saw attentive interlocutors, support and acceptance. Later, somehow imperceptibly, all this grew into romantic feelings. And then Pete's life changed abruptly. From the miserable orphanage with its gray, shabby walls, stinking mattresses and scanty porridge in the morning, he suddenly found himself in a completely different world. No, Pete wasn't adopted. He was a teenager at the time. Who wants one of those? People prefer to adopt cute little babies. That's not what happened. Pete lived with a family until he was 9, and it was a wonderful family. The man's heart still ached when he thought of his parents. It's a shame they can't see what their son has accomplished. Too bad Pete couldn't do something nice for them. He had a lot of money now, and fulfilling his mother and father's dreams wasn't a problem for him. Dad kept talking about a new car because the old 6 was always breaking down. Mom wanted to go to the sea. She had been to the resort only once and now dreamed of repeating this trip. Except that they'd been gone for over 30 years. Pete and his family didn't live poorly, but they were never poor. They had a clean, cozy one-bedroom apartment in which the young heir was allocated a whole room. There was an old car. On it my father took the whole family to the river, then in the woods. These were wonderful trips, even if not to the sea. Pete never went hungry. Yes, sometimes there was not enough money for candy or ice cream, but there was always a pot of borscht or goulash in the refrigerator. Mom worked as a painter. Dad worked at the factory and the shop. There was enough money to live on. We didn't live poorly, but we weren't poor. Pete didn't think about such things at all then. He enjoyed life, a quiet, sunny childhood, socializing with his parents and friends. His mother and father never quarreled. At least Pete didn't remember that. They never raised their voices at their son either, even if he did something wrong. His parents always talked to Pete like an adult, always explained the consequences of his behavior, told him what excessive carelessness could lead to. Pete, in turn, tried not to upset them. He studied well and did not bully. Attitude is more important than anything else in this world, his father had said many times. We have no one else, only us. And that's why it's important for us to protect each other. Pete liked those conversations. He saw their family as a close-knit team. Mom, Dad, Pete, they were each other's rock. It was wonderful to have that kind of support behind him. Pete learned that both his parents had grown up in an orphanage. Sometimes one of them would tell stories about those years. Pete listened to these stories with his mouth open. Mom and Dad's childhood was very different from his own. Different teachers, angry children, a life of starvation. And no one, absolutely no one, cared about these boys and girls. Pete was glad that he lived with loving and understanding parents. Then the boy could not imagine that one day he himself would end up in an orphanage. He could not have dreamed of such a thing. He has a mom and dad, they love him very much. And for complete happiness he lacked grandparents. Many friends had them, and it's great to drink tea with grandmother's cakes, to go fishing with his grandfather. But what can you do? That's life. But his parents are the best. Pete remembered that warm summer day forever. He still sometimes dreamed of flying on his scooter into his hometown yard through the archway. The cool gloom was replaced by bright sunlight and heat. The smell of heated grass hits his nose. Next to me is Lexi, a loyal friend and comrade. They've been sitting at the same desk since first grade. Lexi laughs, talking about something. And Pete. He immediately notices the crowd of neighbors outside his driveway, and his tiny heart clenches with misgivings. Pete still could not understand how he, 9 years old, at first sight then guessed that his parents are in trouble. The boy suddenly wanted to see his mom or dad. Right now, as it usually happens, they would dispel his fears. But his parents had gone to the village in the morning to buy meat. They often visited the local collective farm. The products there were fresh, real, useful. That's what Mom said. Pete often went with them, and he loved these mini vacations. Sitting in the back seat, looking at the road, and there were all fields and hills. It's picturesque. Mother and father are quietly talking about something, making plans. It's nice, peaceful. There's a lot of interesting things in the village itself. Even the smell is different there. Mom always wrinkles her nose, says, "It smells like manure, but Pete likes it for some reason." There are a lot of animals in the village: horses, cows, and goats. It's a common thing for the local kids. And Pete always looked at these animals, opening his eyes in amazement. But that day, the boy stayed home. Lexi suggested scooters at the new park. There are special paths and a fountain recently opened. How could he resist? The parents didn't mind. They always took their son's opinion into account, even when he was a baby. "All right, stay home, if you want," Mom said with a smile and brushed Pete's hair back. "We'll bring you something good to eat," Dad promised, sitting down in the driver's seat. Pete nodded happily. He and Lexi saw their parents off together, standing in the driveway, and of course at the time he couldn't even think about seeing them for the last time. The boy waved goodbye to them, and then headed off with his friend to adventure. It was a wonderful day. Pete and Lexi had a lot of fun riding on the new paths, getting to know the local kids. Splashing in the fountain, their friends had time to climb trees, play with a stray dog, and chase pigeons. It was fun. Summer vacation is the best time. So it was until the moment that divided the boy's life into before and after. The change began at the moment when Pete noticed the neighbors in his driveway. These people, familiar from his earliest childhood, looked anxious, worried, confused. They were discussing something. Lexi hadn't noticed them yet. She kept telling Pete a joke, but he wasn't listening. The boy's attention was on the neighbors. He desperately wanted to see his mom or dad among them. They should have been back by now. But his parents weren't there, which was scary for some reason. It was really scary. Even his palms were sweating, and goosebumps ran down his back. Finally, one of the neighbors noticed Pete and Lexi. He said something to the others, and now there were about a dozen pairs of eyes staring at the friends. Immediately, the boy felt a large shiver begin to hit him. The first to hug Pete was Aunt Stacy, his mom's friend. She often came to their house for tea, and always brought something tasty for the master's son. "Trouble," she said, looking into the boy's eyes. "There is trouble, terrible trouble. You must be strong." Neighbors told Pete that his father had lost control of the car, and the car at high speed went into the ditch. There was a pothole in the road. It hadn't been there before, but it was hard to see it right away. The fault of the road service. Now the dangerous area has been fenced off, no one else will get hurt. But Pete's parents died in that terrible accident. Both of them. That was a hard thing to realize. It's even harder to accept. How could it be? Mother and father were something fundamental, something unshakable. Pete even lost consciousness for a while. He woke up at Aunt Stacy's. She was home in time to call an ambulance. The doctors came and gave the boy some kind of injection. Everyone looked at Pete with sympathy, stroked his head, hugged him. That made it even scarier. The boy did not think about his future. He was in a very strange state. Everything around him suddenly faded, somehow slowed down. Pete saw the world as if from the outside, as if he was just an observer, not a participant in this life. The neighbors took care of the funeral. Pete was staying with Aunt Stacy. He didn't want to go home. It was scary to walk into an empty apartment with no mom and dad. Aunt Stacy had sent the kids to her mother-in-law's for a while. And she must have taken time off work, because Aunt Stacy was always with Pete, never leaving him for a minute. Aunt Stacy often cried when she thought the boy couldn't see or hear her. Next to Pete, she tried to speak in a cheerful voice, even sort of smiling. It looked unnatural. The boy didn't make it to his parents' funeral. They saw them off on their last journey, only friends and neighbors. Pete had a hysteria the night before. He screamed, sobbed, convulsed, which incredibly frightened not only Aunt Stacy, but also himself. The boy would have liked to calm down, but he just couldn't. They took him to the hospital, gave him some pills, gave him some shots, and everything around him became unimportant. Pete lay on the bed and stared up at the white hospital ceiling. Not a very exciting thing for a boy to do. But it didn't seem that way to Pete at the time. A few days passed, the boy seemed to come to his senses. Neighbors were allowed to visit him. In the hospital courtyard, the boy sat on a bench between Aunt Stacy and Aunt Esmeralda. Both had their arms around his shoulders. Across from him stood more people from their home. They were all sad, even gloomy. "You'll have to stay at the orphanage for a while," Aunt Stacy said at last, her voice trembling. "We'll visit you," Aunt Esmeralda added. Pete shuddered. Until now, he hadn't thought about where and with whom he would live. There was too much on his mind at once. And now, hearing the phrase orphanage, the boy was alarmed, frightened. How could it be? His mom and dad had grown up in an orphanage. They had said many times that their son was very lucky to be born in a family. And now he would have to go to an institution like this. Tears came to the boy's eyes. He tried to force them inside, but nothing worked. Neighbors calmed him down, promised to visit him and even take him to their homes for the weekend, if the management of the orphanage allowed it. But Pete realized then, at the age of 9, sitting on a bench in the hospital courtyard, he realized that now he was alone, all alone, no more of their wonderful team. From now on, he would have to make his own way. Something told the boy that it would be difficult. He had to pull himself together, prepare for a long struggle. But at the time, he had no idea what he'd be up against. Looking ahead, it should be said that the neighbors did visit the boy. At first, Aunt Stacy came most often, always dressed up, always with goodies, hugging Pete, asking him about his life. But then these visits became more and more infrequent, and finally came to nothing. The boy was not offended. He understood everything perfectly. After all, he had to grow up sharply. People have their own affairs, their own worries. Not to the neighbor's boy their own problems to deal with. Pete was taken from the hospital by 2 women, one in a police uniform, the other in ordinary clothes. They did not talk to the boy, did not explain anything to him, only gave him dry orders: get in the car, get out. The orphanage at first glance resembled an ordinary kindergarten, which Pitya had visited not so long ago. The same long 3-story building, the same green yard with playgrounds. The policewoman, having signed some papers, left. But the second escort took Pete inside. The boy was shown how everything was organized in the orphanage: several bedrooms with modest beds, a dining room, a playroom, and classrooms. The orphanage was outside the city, so the children did not go to a regular school. Teachers came to visit them themselves. On the first day, Pete was beaten up by local boys just to show who was in charge and stronger. The girls saw this and giggled gloatingly. Then, when the teacher came to the noise, looking her in the eyes, these girls said that the newcomer himself fell down the stairs, when Pete also received from the teacher for carelessness. "You're good, you didn't complain and fight," one of the attackers said afterwards. "I did the right thing. We would have beaten you up even more for that." Pete didn't say anything. He didn't say anything to the teacher out of fear of incurring more anger. Certainly not out of a desire to keep his tormentors out of trouble. The woman just didn't care. She wouldn't help Pete in any way. There was no help to be had here at all. A hostile and evil world. The gray orphan days dragged on. It was hard to get used to it all. Instead of a small but own room, a bedroom for 20 bunks. Instead of mom's delicious homemade food and incomprehensible brew. Instead of acceptance and soulful conversations, complete indifference. At best indifference, or even anger and aggression. There were no friends here, no attentive neighbors. Pete was immediately disliked. He'd been a homeschooled child for 9 years. He'd been loved, pampered, cared for. And these children, most of them, had never known the comfort of home and the love of family. They all had hard fates and believed that those more fortunate were now their eternal debtors. Pete couldn't stand up to this bitterness, not yet at that time. He was shocked by the behavior of his peers. The world was opening up from a completely different perspective. Everything was out of whack. He had to adapt. Pete was often beaten, and it was impossible to predict what would come next time. The boy tried to stay out of sight of his abusers. But how can you do that if you have to sleep in the same bedroom with them every night? Pete was doused with water, tripped over, called names, insulted, spit on, thrown things at, and had to endure it all. Pete tried to make friends with these kids. Not that he liked them, not at all. He just wanted to make his life a little more peaceful and pleasant. But it wasn't working. He and these guys, they were like different species. They had no common ground, no common themes. The boys from the orphanage were bitter and understood only the language of force. They were very different from Pete's friends, like Tom or Jake. Pete realized later that life had made them like that. As an adult, strong and wealthy, he began to help orphanages. If the underprivileged boys and girls realized that at least someone cared, if they saw help, kindness, sympathy, maybe some of them would think that the world is not only aggression and anger. Pete really wanted to hope so. The man was glad that since the time of his childhood, many things in orphanages had become different. And when the favorite happy child had to adapt to a new life in an accelerated mode, schooling had begun. With surprise and annoyance, Pete realized that the lessons here are purely formal. The level of preparation of his classmates was incredibly low. Of course, Pete, who had always studied well, showed his abilities on the first day of school. It didn't happen on purpose. His classmates could not cope with the simplest tasks. They could barely read. Pete was very praised by the teacher. Finally, a smart student, it's a pleasure to work with him, rejoiced Annie Smith. Pete smiled. He liked that he was finally noticed, that they were saying good things about him. But that very evening, he was noticed by a crowd of boys in the backyard. The girls, as always, watched from a distant distance and silently approved. "Here's to you, upstart," said the boys. "You think you're the smartest? Don't show off." Pete was hurt, offended, scared. But he learned his lesson well. He didn't shine his knowledge in class anymore. He kept quiet. He made mistakes on his tests on purpose. Just so he wouldn't be praised anymore. Just so he wouldn't stand out. Just so he wouldn't stand out. Esmeralda was Pete's classmate. She didn't belong to any group of girls, and was friends only with the same quiet girls she was. These girls were often the objects of cruel jokes from their peers. The boys didn't touch them, usually preferring to deal with their own. But Pete quickly realized that girls could sometimes be even more cruel than boys. They made up insults for Esmeralda and her friends that would make people's ears perk up. They also spoiled their belongings, made them take their place on duty, and took away the treats the children were occasionally given in the dining hall. Sometimes there were scuffles with girls in the yard with bites, torn hair, and broken noses. The educators looked the other way. They preferred not to delve into children's conflicts, separated and punished everyone. But some teenagers were simply feared by adults, knew about these children's past and guessed what they were capable of. It was easier for them to lock quiet Esmeralda in a closet for 24 hours than to deal with those who bullied. Pete had been locked up in that closet more than once for nothing, if that's what it took. But he even liked it there, quiet, dark, calm, no one yanking him around, calling him to get out, calling him names. Just sit there and think. One bad thing, hunger quickly began to pester the growing body. Life in the orphanage was half-starved as it was, and then there was punishment. But Pete eventually got used to it. As the years passed, Pete and Esmeralda had already become firm friends, already even began to show between them romantic feelings. The homeboy had changed. He became stronger, more resilient, learned to fight back. And it was all thanks to Esmeralda. It was unbearable to watch a crowd of girls bullying her. Then in the corner she is squeezed and start pinching. Then forced to duty in the kitchen every day. Then she has to wash their socks in the bathroom, a whole mountain of socks. But he couldn't take it. Pete saw the girls kicking the unrequited Esmeralda again one day, and he stood up for her. He knew exactly what he was doing. The girls were taken aback at first, and then they started laughing. Not laughing. One of them, the strongest and toughest, pushed Pete against the wall. The blow was hard enough, but the boy stood his ground and pushed her back. Actually, of course, you can't hit girls. Pete had learned that in his past life when he was in kindergarten. But in front of him now was not a girl, but a monster, unpleasant, angry and ruthless. The girls, accustomed to resolving conflicts by swearing and fighting, pounced on Pete. But even though he was a puny boy, still a boy, he fought back quite well, and at the same time he understood perfectly well that the girls would call for help from the boys. It would be more difficult with them. Pete had been practicing hammering his fists with a flour sack in the closet for a long time, secretly from everyone. This bag replaced his punching bag. He did push-ups, pull-ups. He had to accept the rules of the game. If in this world the strongest survives, what does it mean to become the strongest? "Fool, you'll be in trouble now," warned one of the girls, the recognized leader of the company. The ladies realized that they could not overpower the boy and proudly withdrew. Pete knew exactly what their threats meant. They would tell their buddies. They would take revenge on Pete for his courage. Trouble did loom ahead. But Esmeralda looked at him as a savior, as a hero, and all distant problems under that gaze somehow faded, lost importance. "Thank you," she whispered quietly. "But what about you now? They'll get you, won't they?" Nothing. Pete waved his hand. "I'm not afraid of them." And at that moment he really wasn't afraid of reprisals. He didn't care. What mattered was that Esmeralda was looking at him in a special way and smiling. They sat together on the bench for a long time afterward and chatted about this and that, learning new things about each other. It turned out that Esmeralda's mother had died in the maternity hospital. She seemed to be a very young girl. The relatives didn't want to take the baby. It was an embarrassment to them. So Esmeralda lived from infancy in children's institutions. Apparently, such a fate of a granddaughter, in the opinion of relatives, was not a disgrace. That was her story. Of course, payback caught up with Pete very soon. "Are you the coolest guy in the world now?" was the question one of his attackers asked him. The question was, of course, purely rhetorical. Of course, Pete was beaten, and badly. The girls were nearby. They suggested to their defenders ways to humiliate the victim, one more sophisticated than the other. But that time Pete still fought back. He managed to break a couple of noses, kick someone in the stomach, and then found himself in the dust on the ground. And he was the only one who got hit. But still the boys were surprised. Before, the victim was wordless and toothless, and then suddenly it was like this. He was less likely to be touched. No one wanted to get punched in the teeth or nose by a mob. And there was the occasional one-on-one attack. No, not anymore. Pete sighed, stretched, turned off the computer. Time to go home. Tomorrow he could sleep in a little longer, spend time with his family. The man threw on his coat, walked out of the office. His car was parked in the back of the restaurant. Where the garbage cans stood, food that customers got fed up with was thrown into them. So homeless people who wanted to satisfy their hunger often hung around here. Pete wasn't surprised to see an elderly woman in tattered clothes and shot sneakers, clearly off someone else's foot, standing next to the bins. Pete didn't chase the homeless away from the bins. On the contrary, he asked the staff to leave the food in the containers on the site, not to throw it all in the bucket. He felt sorry for these destitute people. Poor thing, he thought. But the woman, smelling the presence of a man, was frightened, shuddered, turned around. She looked anxiously at him. Pete was dumbfounded. This old woman? No, such a thing is simply impossible. She was very much like the man who had once played a pivotal role in his life. The man gazed intently into the poor woman's face. The woman also looked at him studyingly. After a few years of surviving in the orphanage, an amazing thing happened in Pete's life. A new English teacher, Laurel Swan, came to visit. The class, as always, began to test her on the first day. Mean jokes, attempts to disrupt the lesson, even direct insults. Usually the teachers either lost it or lost their temper. But Laurel Swan looked at the troublemakers with sadness and even pity. It was amazing. Pete, who, as always, was ashamed of his classmates, watched Laurel Swan with interest. This was an unusual person. It was immediately felt. The new teacher had an interesting lesson. She didn't torture the class with the necessary rules, but turned on cartoons in English. The pupils at first, out of habit, only tried to make jokes, but somehow they got involved. Even the most disinterested in learning bullies. Then Laurel Swan began to ask questions. Pete, to his own surprise, knew all the answers. As he answered, the teacher shook her head approvingly and smiled. She seemed to be impressed by the able pupil. She hadn't expected to find such a one here. Pete was no longer afraid of being pushed and taunted by the local bullies, so he answered as he saw fit. "You're an amazingly talented boy," she praised Pete when the others had left, and he realized that the teacher purposely did not shower him with compliments in front of his classmates so as not to arouse their envy. What an intelligent and sensitive person, Pete thought. "Thank you," said the embarrassed and delighted Pete. It had been a long time since anyone had been so attentive to him. "Tomorrow I'll bring you some textbooks to study with the kids. What about you? You should be interested in something else," Laurel said. And indeed, the next lesson she brought a bright, colorful textbook. There were many fascinating stories in the form of comics. "We will repeat the material with the students for now," said the teacher. "You don't need it. Read it and tell me if you understand it," Laurel Swan said to Pete. Pete delved into the reading. The bright pictures were pleasing to the eye. The boy was engrossed in the story, and he didn't notice how the lesson flew by. "Did you understand anything?" Laurel Swan leaned over the desk with a smile. "I understood everything, but I didn't have time to finish it. Too bad." "Interesting," Pete said. "Take the book with you. You'll have time to read it." "Yeah, you do? I bought it for my daughter, but she didn't seem interested." "Let it serve someone," the teacher added. Laurel Swan made Pete's life happier and more pleasant, gave it a special meaning, and the other children liked her a lot too. It was a rare teacher who interacted with the class not through humiliation and insults, but through explanations, frank conversations on the heart. Both girls and boys were drawn to her. But it was obvious to everyone that Laurel Swan was Pete's favorite. But there were no objections. The classmates saw that Pete was making great progress in English. He helped them too. He never said no to anyone, even the ones who had recently beaten him up in the backyard. Pete devoured one after another of the interesting English books Laurel Swan brought him. Then the teacher handed the boy a player with several CDs. "Reading is one thing," she said. "You could use some listening too. English is a little hard to listen to, but you'll do fine. I know." "Thank you," Pete said, but he looked at the player with doubt. "It's expensive. There's no guarantee that the boys won't take it away from me. I'm afraid I can't take it." Laurel Swan seemed to understand. "I'll make a deal with the principal," she said. "He'll let you into the classrooms after school at certain hours when no one is here. That's where you'll study. Is that all right with you?" "Of course it is," Pete exclaimed. It was so nice to do something he loved and enjoyed in the silence of an empty classroom. It was not only learning English, but also a great opportunity to be alone with himself. This privacy Pete really lacked in the orphanage. And this is beautiful. Pete often talked to Laurel Swan about more than just English. They had become almost real friends. Pete told his teacher about his tragedy. It was so nice to share moments from the past with someone. The woman shook her head, sighing from time to time. "Oh, you've had a hard time, Pete," she said. Not always the conversations between the teacher and the able pupil were so heavy and serious. Sometimes they laughed and joked, sometimes they discussed the news, sometimes they argued, and sometimes they were happy to find that they agreed. Esmeralda liked Laurel Swan too, but she was shy of the teacher. A girl of that age in general was afraid of everyone and everything. Pete saw that life in the orphanage had a negative effect on Esmeralda. Kind and sensitive by nature, she couldn't stand the pressure. At least now Esmeralda had him, Pete. He wouldn't let her get hurt. One day Laurel Swan suggested Pete enter a regional competition. He had to write an essay in English, decorate it with drawings and send it to New York. "Why, you've got a great imagination and a high level of language skills. You'll do great," said the teacher. "Well, I don't know," Pete hesitated. "Who is he?" "A kid from the orphanage. The other kids are homeschooled, they go abroad and tutor. How can he compare to them?" "I know," said Laurel Swan confidently. "All you will succeed." "What's there to write about?" Pete asked. "The theme is summer vacation. Describe the perfect day of your happiest vacation. I think that would be good." Pete thought for a moment. He knew right away what kind of day he would write about. Mom and Dad were still with him then. They both had the day off. They got up early, got in the car, and drove into the woods to get mushrooms. That day they saw a deer up close. The deer jumped out onto the road, gave the men a worried look, even trembled. And then suddenly, as if it realized that these people were not dangerous. By some inner instinct the deer guessed, and just went about its business. It began to nibble the grass, letting them admire themselves. It was a real miracle. All three of them froze, watching the cute animal. Then there was a wonderful picnic in the woods. Mom made her signature pies with onions and eggs, which Pete loved so much. We picked a lot of mushrooms. In the evening, Dad fried potatoes with them. Adrian showed up at the smell. He lived one floor down, and he knew what was coming. "And here you are, you lazybones," he exclaimed. All three of them started talking about Adrian. "Will you take me next time?" the boy asked with hope in his eyes. "Of course we will," his father promised. "And that was today too. Should I take you with me?" Well, did not guess something. But the promised joint trip never happened. Instead, Pete ended up in an orphanage. I wonder how Lexi is doing now. All grown up, I guess. Does he still remember his childhood friend, Pete thought. At that moment, he didn't know and couldn't know that not only had Lexi not forgotten him, but he was trying to make his way back to him. But it was difficult. The orphanage and its grounds were behind a high, blank fence. In addition, the site itself was located far away from the city. Lexi was just a kid. Still, he had come to the gate several times and begged the guard to let him in, or at least to send word to his friend. The guard invariably turned the boy away. Of course, he never sent any message to Pete. Juvenile visits were not allowed. Lexi's parents were going through a divorce and couldn't handle their son's requests. He begged them to go to Pete's with him, but to no avail. "I don't have time," they said. And then, when the parents took pity on Lexi, well, how did they take pity? It was just a fight over who the son loved more. During this period, each parent tried to fulfill Lexi's every wish. Anyway, Lexi's dad called the orphanage to arrange a date. But Pete was no longer there. He was transferred to another place. And all thanks to Laurel Swan, her faith in a talented student. Pete learned all of this later, when Lexi found an old friend on social media. They met as if the years apart had never happened. Lexi is still Pete's best friend, reliable, loyal, always there for him. Laurel Swan insisted. Pete took the essay. It was a passion for the boy. It was so nice to remember that happy day. Esmeralda helped her friend and took care of the design. Pete was not much of a draftsman, but she was very good at it. Esmeralda drew a deer so cute, and most importantly, so remarkably similar to the deer Pete had once seen. "I've never been in the woods," she smiled sadly. "We'll go for a walk with you. When we grow up, will we get out of here? I wish we could. Maybe life will be better later." "It will be. I've lived there. It's really nice there," Pete said. He was still surprised that Esmeralda had spent her whole life in those walls and had no idea what most people were like. Well, she would have a pleasant surprise when she left the orphanage. The essay won the prize and went to the all-Russian stage of the contest. Only this stage was not absentee. It was required to come to New York in person. The format was as follows: each participant goes on stage and receives a task from the jury to compose a story on a certain topic. You have to orient yourself lightning fast, improvise, fantasize. "You can do it. You can definitely do it," Laurel Swan excitedly paced the class. "You can win. I know you can. And the prize is a ticket to the future. Free education in a boarding school for gifted children. It's a really worthwhile institution. If you get there, you're lucky, and that's it. You'll become a successful person. Graduates from there are supervised and guided. First, the most prestigious universities queue up, and then employers. You have every chance, every right to have that future." Pete, who of course was already thinking about the future, realized how important it was for him to participate in this competition. It made him anxious and excited. What if he couldn't handle it? "I will prepare you," Laurel Swan continued, as if she had heard the thoughts of her promising student. "You are more worthy of this place than anyone else. We'll study hard. You'll do well." And indeed, Laurel Swan began to study with Pete separately on an accelerated program. The principal was happy about that. If his pupil won a competition of this level, it was a big plus for their orphanage. He allowed Pete and Laurel Swan to take the class after school, and even provided them with everything they needed: a VCR, a laptop, a record player. "It's not enough," Laurel Swan worried. "We have to do it on the weekends too. I'll talk to the principal. Maybe he'll let you come to my house on weekends, because you have a great potential, but you don't have enough base. You have to work hard, and everything will work out." The director said it's okay. Moreover, he even allocated money from the budget of the orphanage for bus fare. Not a huge sum, but still, for the first time in many years, Pete was alone in the city. He waited for the right bus, got on the empty seat. It was so nice to ride through the city like that, looking out the window. Laurel Swan met him at the bus stop. It was a little unusual to see her outside the school office, but it was nice too. Their path wound through the park. They chatted, laughed, joked. Pete suddenly imagined that he was just an ordinary kid. He was no different from the boys around him, was he? And there he is, walking next to his aunt or even his mom. They're talking about something, smiling. It's a typical picture. The people around them don't realize that this is what happiness looks like. For them, it's all routine. It's amazing how complicated life is, Pete thought. "There's my house," Laurel Swan said. Pete looked around at the high-rise buildings. A standard dwelling in a typical yard. He'd lived in one like it with his parents, and he'd go back there to his own apartment. When he turned 18, Laurel Swan's apartment was exactly like his parents', which made it seem familiar. 2 rooms, a small but cozy kitchen. Pete looked around with interest. It was obvious that Laurel Swan was not a rich man. Simple furniture, inexpensive wallpaper. But there was a special atmosphere in these rooms, warm, soft, soothing. It must be nice to live here. Pete knew Laurel Swan had a daughter, Linda, about his age. "I'd love to meet her." Laurel Swan must have raised an interesting person. The boy hoped it would be wonderful to be friends with the teacher's daughter, if he could make another friend. There were so few of them in his life, after all. The teacher never talked much about her daughter. They discussed all sorts of things, but not Linda. That was even more interesting. The boy had no idea what she was like. But as soon as Linda entered the apartment, Pete realized that they were unlikely to become friends. Laurel Swan was at that moment explaining to a student at the kitchen table the rules of constructing complex English sentences. A kettle was boiling on the stove, and an apple pie was cooking in the oven. Pete was anticipating a pleasant tea party, and then the door rattled open, and a teenage girl appeared on the doorstep. A daring miniskirt, revealing long, skinny legs with sharp knees, a tight top, thick platform shoes. Her short hair was dyed a strange green color, her large eyes thickly lined with black. Her eyelashes were clumped together from a thick coat of mascara. Pete stared at the girl in surprise. He had imagined Linda quite differently, not a Turgenevian young lady, of course, but not like that either. This Linda reminded him subtly of the aggressive girls from the orphanage. And it wasn't about her appearance. Well, maybe the girl likes this image? She has the right to express herself. The essence was something else: a cold, prickly look, contemptuously compressed lips, deliberately swaggering manner of movement. "Linda, hello." Laurel Swan smiled at her daughter. "This is Pete. I told you about him, remember? He's getting ready for the pageant." "Hi," the boy waved his hand. Linda gave the guest a haughty look and turned to her mother, ignoring the greeting. "Do you have anything to eat?" "I won't be long." Laurel Swan scurried to the refrigerator. "Yes, of course," she said. "I'll eat in my room," Linda said, and left. Pete was embarrassed by the scene. Linda appeared to be an insolent and boorish person. Laurel Swan seemed to be ashamed of her behavior. Soon, loud pop music came from the room. Laurel Swan took a plate of pilaf to her daughter. Pete could hear the teacher trying to get her daughter to turn the music down, as it was impossible to study in such a noisy environment. "It's my house. I do what I want. If he doesn't like it, let him go to his own place," was the rude reply. It didn't last long, though. Linda changed her clothes and found herself at the door again. This time she was wearing ultra-short shorts. "What are you looking at?" she said menacingly to Pete. "Do you like me?" Pete blushed. "Where are you going? When are you coming back?" Laurel Swan became alarmed. She hadn't made a single comment about her daughter's appearance. It would have been useless to do so, apparently. "None of your business," the girl said rudely and slipped out the door. "Well, now we can get on with the class," Laurel Swan smiled sadly. Why? Why is she like that? Pete couldn't help but wonder. After a moment, he realized that such talk could be unpleasant for the teacher. But Laurel Swan sighed sadly and sat down opposite him. "You're a big boy, you understand a lot of things," she said. "I just couldn't cope with raising my daughter. I will teach other children, but myself. A cobbler without boots." Laurel Swan raised Linda alone. She was never married at all. Linda's father was the kind of guy who avoided responsibility. An adventurous individual living the life of an adventurer. And this character once met on the way of a quiet, modest girl who, probably for the first time in her life, went with her friends to a disco. What attracted him to her? Maybe it was the fact that she was different from himself. Exotic, so to speak. Either way, it was not difficult for an experienced man to interest an unsophisticated young person. It wasn't even an affair. They spent about 24 hours together. The young lady was in slight shock at how many events contained in these hours. Where she had been, what she had seen. Linda's father knew how to be interesting, knew how to organize exciting leisure time. He tried on different roles and masterfully played them himself, enjoying it. The morning he vaporized, as if he was not there. The girl managed to fall in love with him. She was looking for a mysterious beau for a long time, but he seemed to disappear into the water. Most likely, he was irrepressible. Laurel Swan had a daughter to remember the tumultuous but short-lived affair. "I was even glad then," she said. "For a long time I hoped that he would come back. And here I am with a baby. I thought his heart would be moved. We will live together." Then I realized, of course, that it was all just nonsense. Laurel Swan by that time had already graduated from the Teacher Training Institute and managed to get a job at the local gymnasium. She had to go on maternity leave. Money was tight. Laurel Swan lived with her mother in this very apartment. The old woman's pension was small, and her child allowance seemed even smaller. So Laurel Swan took up tutoring, running around all day in other people's apartments. She pounded hard truths into the heads of mostly neglectful students. Their parents were willing to pay a lot of money to make their children speak English. But the children themselves did not want to learn the language. Laurel Swan had to break through the wall of reluctance, and sometimes even disgust. Not a very pleasant occupation. But it paid good money. Linda was being looked after by her grandmother, and she was the first to notice the warning signs. "Something she is some kind of too capricious. Always she is drawn somewhere," complained the old lady. "She doesn't listen to me at all. I punish her blindly, but she does not care. Today she cut off my favorite sweater with scissors to spite me. Especially still looked at me, waiting for a reaction," continued to complain grandmother. "And then she said, 'I'm sorry, Mom,' well, something like that," Laurel Swan objected tiredly. And only 2.5 years old. What revenge? What disobedience? The child is just learning about the world, that's all. It's normal. Laurel Swan loved it when her daughter would run to the door in the evening. The first thing she did was to look in the bag, looking for something tasty, and always found a chocolate bar, or sweet fruit, or flavored buns. Laurel Swan did her best to please her daughter. Who else would make her happy? No father. Time passed. Linda went to kindergarten, where Laurel Swan returned to grammar school. That's where the trouble started. Now the teachers were complaining about Linda. She hits other kids, encourages the boys to play pranks, spits when she's in the wrong. The woman promised to talk to her daughter to improve the situation, and she did. But with her mother, Linda behaved like a real angel. It seemed that everyone was slandering the poor girl. The grandmother, the teachers. And then Laurel Swan's mother died suddenly, a heart attack, and the woman was left alone with her daughter. It was just about time for Linda to start first grade. But then Laurel Swan herself had to admit there was something wrong with her daughter. Linda categorically refused to learn. The girl was prepared for school at a fee-based center. They didn't talk about the problems there. Why scare clients who are paying good money? It turned out that Linda can neither read, nor write, nor operate even the smallest numbers. And worst of all, she doesn't want to learn those skills. Laurel Swan worked very hard. She practiced with her daughter every day, patiently endured her whims and reproaches. Only threats worked. Read the page, solve the examples, then you can go outside. Otherwise you'll stay home, Linda. The street beckoned to her with a terrible force. Sitting at home in four walls, it was for her like a prison. The girl shouted at her mother, called her names, threw notebooks and textbooks at the wall, and still had to fulfill the requirements of the parent. Then Linda was even weaker than her mother, physically weaker. And then, when she was older, Linda simply pushed Laurel Swan aside and went outside or ran away when she was at work. A woman couldn't guard her daughter 24 hours a day. Sometimes Linda just didn't make it home from school, going straight out to travel the neighborhood in the company of dubious friends. Laurel Swan was worried about her daughter and didn't know what to do. Prohibitions didn't help. In addition, Linda cheated, insulted her mother, took valuables from the house, which it seems then sold. She needed something to entertain herself with. Laurel Swan first smelled cigarettes on 10-year-old Linda. After getting drunk, the teacher's daughter showed up for the first time when she was 13. Laurel Swan talked a lot with her girl, told her how such behavior can turn out, what troubles await teenagers on the street. But Linda only smiled and looked down on her mother as if she were a fool. "What do you know about the free life, about the street?" she used to say. "You've spent your whole life fulfilling other people's wishes and expectations, parents, neighbors, and all that. And I don't care what people say. I was born free. And you're angry about it. I'm not like you." It was the truth. Linda, both in appearance and, most disturbingly, in character, took after the father she had never known or seen. There it was, the monstrous power of genes. The same frivolous adventurer, the same liar and actress, the same rule-breaking adventurer. Laurel Swan fought for her daughter. She still hoped that nurture could overcome genetics. The woman took Linda to psychologists and psychotherapists, tried to become more of a friend, and give the girl more freedom. All in vain. The older Linda got, the more the chasm unfolded between them. It was so unlike Laurel Swan's relationship with her own mother. No warmth of heart, no mutual support, no shared interests. Linda seemed to despise her mother for her dull gray life, her poverty, her intellectualism. This girl herself considered herself an ideal. She could afford to do what she wanted. For example, to send the teacher in the classroom for the fact that she was picking on her appearance, or smoking on the school porch. Gradually, her parents became Linda's servants. Her mother fed her, made her money, gave her a roof over her head. She's necessary, only for this. True, she had to pay, listen to the occasional lecture. But Linda learned long ago to ignore them. Maybe it's just her age, Pete suggested after listening to Laurel Swan. There was so much pain in her eyes that he wanted something to comfort her. "That's what I hope," she replied. "As time passes, Linda will calm down, come to her senses. Think about the future, so long as nothing bad happens to her in the meantime." "I'm so scared for her." "Well, we're getting a little distracted. You need to study. Open your textbook to page 3. Pete came to Laurel Swan's house every Sunday. They studied hard for the pageant. They also drank fragrant tea with delicious homemade pastries and talked about very interesting topics. Laurel Swan tried to answer all of Pete's questions. She didn't dismiss any of them. She was wise, empathetic, and worried. Sometimes Linda was home during these sessions. One day she piled into the hallway, drunk at 15. She reeked of booze, tobacco smoke, and the girl's legs were a mess. It was late morning. It looked like Linda hadn't been home last night. The girl passed out in the hallway. Pete helped the teacher drag her senseless body to the bed. "It's just the way we live," Laurel Swan sighed later. "Nothing works on her. Linda was even worse than the violent girls at the orphanage. Those were toughened by their hard fate and the need to fight for survival. And Linda, why? She has clothes and her own room and delicious food. And most importantly, such a wonderful mom." Once, in Pete's presence, Linda insulted Laurel Swan. She tried to ask her daughter if she would be back for dinner. The girl was irritated about something. She unleashed an angry tirade on her mother, and Pete stood up for Laurel. "But she doesn't deserve to be treated like that," he said. And then something happened that the boy never expected. Linda jumped up and slapped him so hard that his eyes went black. "You're going to tell me what to do in my own house," she shouted. Linda's eyes burned with evil fire. "You bitch." From then on, Pete thought the girl was crazy sick. "Well, it happens. Not necessarily. People with mental illness look like fools. Some of them are geniuses," he said. "A normal person can't be like that." One day the boy even shared his speculations with his teacher. He was worried before the conversation, afraid to offend Laurel, but she realized that it was just an expression of concern for herself. "No, there's nothing wrong with her mentally. I've had her seen by several psychiatrists since she was a baby. The verdict is clear, everything is within normal limits," Laurel replied. Pete didn't tell anyone about Laurel's daughter. The teacher didn't ask him specifically, but he understood it himself. He only shared it with Irina. They always told each other everything. "Silly Linda doesn't understand her happiness," the girl shook her head. "I wish I had such a mother." Irina felt sorry for the kind teacher. Other children were drawn to Laurel, even the worst bullies. And her own daughter? Closer to the date of the competition, one serious problem came to light. It turned out that the participants had to pay for their own transportation. And this is a lot of money: tickets for the child and the chaperone, a few days of hotel accommodation, meals. "But no, I can't allocate such a sum," the director of the orphanage refused at once. "Where from? We need to fix the roof. And it's fall, and many of the children have outgrown warm clothes." Pete heard Laurel Swan persuading the director of the orphanage, convincing him that Pete's participation in the contest was a chance for a normal life. Then she tried to prove that his win was good for the orphanage. "You're going to get so many sponsors after this. They will fix the roof, buy clothes for the children, and make a sports field," she said. "He still has to win. And where are the guarantees?" objected the director. "He has great potential, no doubt. But I don't believe that our pupil could beat everyone at an event of this level and scale." Pete was catching every word, and everything was tightening inside him. Could it be that because of financial difficulties he would not even go to the competition? It turned out that he had practiced, tried, and hoped for nothing. The boy had a goal, a dream, and now he felt like the ground had been knocked out from under him. "I'll think of something," Laurel Swan promised Pete, who was barely holding back tears. "Don't worry, I'll find the money and we'll go to the pageant. You'll see." Laurel has since begun to pound the doorsteps of the administration. She even appealed to city businessmen, but apparently no one believed in the talents of the boy from the orphanage. No one was interested in the teacher's proposals. Pete saw how hard Laurel was working for him. He was very grateful to her for that. But he'd already accepted the fact that it wasn't going to work out. It was obvious. But one morning before school started, the teacher approached Pete. The boy was usually the earliest to get to class. He liked this quiet time in the morning, standing at the window, looking out at the street while the others bustled about before the next school day. "We're going," Laurel told Pete with shining eyes of joy. "I managed to find the right amount of money." "Where? How?" The boy's heart thumped in his chest like a captured animal. "There are still people who care," the teacher replied evasively. "The world is not without good people." Much later, on the eve of his departure, Pete learned that Laurel, having failed to achieve results, had simply taken out a loan. The payments were exorbitant for her, but she had decided to do it. Pete went to Laurel Swan's house on Sunday as usual. He hoped he wouldn't see Linda today, but she was home. "You should be glad you're going to Washington," the girl measured him with a scornful glance. "Your mother took out a loan because of you. She's always been a fool. She's always been a fool. She's always been stupid. Would not have her own daughter to buy brand-name sneakers. But no, she'd rather spend her money on something stupid. She's pissing me off on purpose." "Are you here for me?" Pete turned to Laurel. She suddenly blushed as if she'd done something embarrassing. She was embarrassed that Pete had found out the truth. "Don't think about it," she said. I've been wanting to go to Washington myself for a long time. Anyway, it's such a chance. The principal's going to give me a raise after you win. I'll pay off the loan. It's okay." After that, Pete decided he was going to win. He would win at any cost. He couldn't let Laurel Swan down. And the kid won that pageant. Standing on the stage in the spotlight, he felt no excitement. His mind was clear and bright. It was a tough subject. You could say he was unlucky. But Pete did it. He gave such a monologue that the whole hall applauded him for a long time. The results were to be announced the next day. Objectively, you were the best, but it's possible Laurel was worried. You can't rule out Blatt connections. Pete was not among the winners. They announced third place, then second place. Laurel looked hopefully at the stage. Pete, however, was already convinced that it had failed. And then the announcer called out his name. The room erupted in applause. First place. Victory. And then it was all over in a flash. Pete didn't even realize it. He returned to the orphanage, where he was greeted as a winner should be greeted. Esmeralda even cried tears of joy. And Laurel Swan, she was glowing with happiness that everything had worked out. Soon people from the boarding school for gifted children came to pick Pete up. They spent a couple of days taking care of him. Some formal moments preparing documents, studying the boy's personal history. Pete realized that they were taking him somewhere to a new life, which he deserved, according to Laurel Swan. He had a future now. A brilliant future. Pete would become strong, smart, wealthy. He won the lucky ticket thanks to Laurel, of course, and the support of Esmeralda. They're the ones who are very hard to part with. They're the people closest to Pete. Esmeralda's a bit of a worry to leave behind. How's she going to be here without him for another 3 years? Who's going to protect her? Laurel promised to keep an eye on her. Still, it's scary and sad and hard. It would be a long time without seeing her loved ones. On the other hand, it's worth it to be patient for a few years. After all, then Pete will become an influential and wealthy man, will do everything for it. And then he would thank Laurel and make Esmeralda's life a fairy tale. The second point Pete managed to realize, not immediately, of course. First, the boy spent 3 years in a boarding school for gifted children. It was a real palace with a magnificent garden. A separate room, classrooms, equipped with the latest technology. Smart, motivated kids. Pete finally made friends here, local kids. He had a lot of common topics and interests, so friendships formed somehow by themselves. The teachers noticed the smallest abilities of their students and tried to develop them. They were very pleasant and educated people, communication with whom enriched and developed. But Pete had never had such a warm relationship with anyone as he had with Laurel. He often remembered his teacher, worried about whether it was hard for her to pay off the loan, whether Linda was hurting her. After graduating from boarding school, Pete entered the University of Washington without exams. During the years of study, the guy managed to win several Olympiads at the national level, which gave him special preferences. Many boarding school graduates entered prestigious universities in this way, without exams. Scholarship, dormitory, support of mentors who continued to supervise and accompany students even after graduation. Pete's life became easier, calmer, more interesting. While still a student, he found a job. He was hired by a large tour company as a translator. Pete began to earn good money. That's when he was finally able to return to his hometown. And he was eager to see Laurel and, of course, to find Esmeralda. Finding Esmeralda was no problem. The director of the orphanage gave the address of the apartment, which the girl received after graduation as a round orphan. It was some kind of barrack-type shanty town in the middle of nowhere. Always drunken neighbors, mountains of garbage everywhere. Esmeralda graduated from college and now worked as a dressmaker's assistant in an attire. She made a pittance, lived in a hole. "I never thought you'd come back." Esmeralda's eyes shone like 2 bright stars at the sight of Pete. "How grown up are you now? Are you handsome?" "How could I leave you?" Pete smiled, hugging her. "I missed you so much. You won't live here anymore. You won't stay a single day in this horrible house." That same evening, Pete helped Esmeralda move into her parents' apartment. It had been empty the whole time. The old neighbors were gone, the older ones had died. The younger ones had moved out. Too bad. It would have been nice to talk to old friends, Pete sighed. But the main thing is that Esmeralda will have a normal life now. I'll feel better. And it's nice to have a loved one living in my own apartment. It makes my soul feel warmer. But Laurel was never found. Her apartment was now occupied by new tenants. The landlady sold it to us 2 years ago, said the woman in a bathrobe who opened the door for Pete. She and her daughter had moved somewhere in the country, I think. I don't know the details. I don't need to know. Pete returned to Washington and continued to study and work. But now every vacation he returned home to Seattle, where Esmeralda was waiting for him. After graduation, Pete was hired by the State Department. The position was offered at once responsible and highly paid. As Laurel Swan had once assumed, winning a prestigious competition became Pete's ticket to life. Now he was being guided and supervised. The boy's life seemed to run on carefully laid rails. Everything seemed to work itself out. Pete bought an apartment in Washington. Esmeralda moved in with him. They got married. Pete was moving up the career ladder. He had to work hard, but it paid off. Esmeralda stayed at home, taking care of the children and the household. She sincerely enjoyed motherhood and loved her husband very much. Pete was pleased and warm to come home from work. The man made several more attempts to find Laurel, but to no avail. Her tracks were lost after moving out of her old apartment. Too bad for Pete. He so wanted to thank her again, so wanted her to see what he had accomplished. All her efforts were not in vain. A good woman deserves to be thanked, and not just verbal gratitude. After a few years, Pete realized that working in the ministry takes too much time and energy. He was missing out on happy and important moments. The son went to the first grade, but the father did not get to the lineup because of an urgent meeting. The daughter performed for the first time with a ballet group in the theater. But busy Pete at this time was conducting important negotiations, and the man decided to go into the restaurant business. And the opportunity to open his own business presented itself. And now Pete has a chain of restaurants in the capital. He's his own boss. Work, of course, you have to work a lot, but the man is able to regulate his own schedule so that everywhere has time. And that's just great. Today he stayed up late with reports, but tomorrow he has a free day to devote to his family. Pete left the office with a feeling of accomplishment. On the street, he smiled at the anticipation of seeing his wife and children. And there's this old woman at the restaurant bins who looks a lot like Laurel Swan. That resemblance is frightening. But the woman at the dumpster certainly can't be Laurel. The teacher has a place to live, and she had a job, which means she has a pension. Hello, Pete. The woman smiled sadly. Is this how you've grown up? Handsome, mature, strong. Just like you always dreamed you'd be. Laurel Swan? Pete asked in disbelief. The woman nodded her head. Pete invited her into his office. On the way, they both expressed their joy at the chance meeting, each in their own way. Laurel smiled warmly and a little embarrassed. Pete was talking excitedly about his life and how long he had been looking for her. Finally, they were in Pete's office. It's nice and cozy here, the man said, and gestured for Laurel to sit down on a comfortable couch in the corner, placed especially for visitors. Then he made coffee for the guest himself, put cookies in a plate for the visitors. Usually Lexi's secretary took care of the guests, but at this late hour, of course, she was at home. Laurel, it's just amazing that we met. I've been thinking about you so much, looking for you for so long. I wanted you to know how much I've achieved thanks to you. Thanks to yourself, the older woman corrected, looking at Pete with pride. Talented, persistent, hardworking. That's what made it all work. You know very well that if it hadn't been for you, I don't know who I'd be now. A good man. You'd still be a good man without me, and you'd still be a success. Maybe not so soon. Of course, kids like you with a backbone, you can tell. You can trust me. I have a lot of experience. But why you? Pete hesitated, searching for words. How did you end up in this position? It's obvious that you need. It's obvious I'm old, Laurel Swan sighed. And speak plainly. It was obvious that she was uncomfortable in front of her former student, ashamed that he could see her in this position. Tell me, Pete asked. Okay, Laurel nodded. It's a long story, and I can't say I'm surprised by the ending. It was coming. After Pete was taken away to a boarding school for gifted children, I started having a lot of trouble with Linda. The 15-year-old girl was now often spending the night with who knows where, showing up home in the morning, or even a few days after she went missing. Sometimes she was brought by the police, whom I asked for help, because the girl was a minor. Exhortations, threats, heart-to-heart talks, everything was bypassed. I even tried to lock my daughter up when I went to work. I couldn't work, I had to live on something. But one day a freedom-loving person cleaned through the balcony, tied the sheets and went down them from the 4th floor. After that I stopped locking her up. It's dangerous. The teenager now spoke to her mother only in foul language. All the valuables, jewelry, appliances were missing from the house. Someone even took the washing machine. Linda needed money for booze, for the bars that attracted her so much. She didn't seem to see any other pleasures, although I tried from childhood to instill in her a love of beauty, books, theater, learning new things. In everything that happened to my daughter, I partly blamed her bad company, marginal teenagers from dysfunctional families. They didn't study, they didn't work. Glassy, completely empty eyes, the stamp of limitation on their faces, ungroomed, perpetually gray and ragged. And these people somehow had a great influence on her daughter. Linda was hospitalized several times. Her young body could not withstand such a life. Doctors warned that if the teenager continues in the same vein, the consequences could be fatal. So Laurel decided to take drastic measures to take her daughter to the village. Yes, sell the apartment, buy a house in a remote village, away from civilization. Fresh air, physical labor, breaking old ties. And the change of scenery itself, according to the desperate mother, should have brought Linda to her senses. It was hard to get out of her own way like that, to leave everything behind and sell the apartment. And there was no guarantee that Linda would get better. But I had to try. I had to do something. Laurel sighed. Did you show her to the doctors? Of course. Once I even managed to put her in the clinic, but she ran away from there, and then refused to go to specialists at all. She was happy with everything. She didn't consider herself sick. It's not like she had to be carried around on a horse. Linda was furious when she heard her mother's decision. At first, she refused to go with her to the village, so Laurel went to her new place of residence alone. The woman was at a loss. She had only made the move for her daughter's sake, and Linda had found a way to stay in the city, living with someone from her company. It seemed that Laurel's move had backfired. She herself had pushed her daughter closer to those she had tried to keep her away from. But then Linda was back, angry, thin, wrinkled. She was quickly turning on those she so loved to spend time with. Apparently she lived with one of her friends, but the cramped overcrowding, the lack of money, the constant yelling and fighting, such conditions did not suit her. And she had to live on something. So Linda gritted her teeth and returned to her mother. At least she would always feed and provide a clean bed. Laurel Swan was a little relieved. Maybe her plan would work after all. Maybe Linda would come to her senses here. Nothing of the sort. Soon Linda's old friends began to visit the village. Sometimes the girl herself went to the city. 150 kilometers was not such an insurmountable obstacle. Leisure activities continued. Moreover, sociable Linda, and in the village, found a similar company. There was one overgrown, garbage-strewn house with a leaky roof. In it lived a woman with 5 small children from different fathers. Maybe the lady herself did not know who her children were from, as she was almost always drunk. In this house there were endless parties, in which Linda took part with pleasure. And then one day Laurel noticed that her daughter had a rounded belly. Linda, it turned out, was expecting a baby. Yes, she shrugged her sharp shoulders when her mother shared her suspicions with her. What's the big deal? I'm 18 years old. I have the right. Who's the father? Laurel asked. Was he one of our village fathers? I'm a townie, but honestly I don't remember his name very well. We met at the club. To be honest, I can hardly even remember what he looked like. Well, it's just like you used to be. Doesn't it remind you of anything? Laurel clutched at her heart, and Linda smiled happily. She always liked to shock her mother. Even when she was pregnant, Linda was still living her usual lifestyle, drinking, smoking, disappearing to the city, and then to the village house. Her mother's request to stop drinking did not touch her. It seems that she was absolutely indifferent to the fate of her own child. None of your business. That's all Laurel heard in response to her exhortations. Laurel's grandson was born well before his due date. He was so tiny, so weak. Linda was wheeled into the birthing center right off the street since she was just in town. The contractions curled her up in front of the store. The baby was born weak and sickly and was left in the hospital. Linda was discharged alone. With her coveted freedom, she plunged headlong into her old life. Laurel Swan went to see Willie and talked to the doctors. The baby wasn't doing well. Linda's lifestyle during pregnancy had not gone unnoticed. Underdeveloped many organs and systems, heart defect, brain damage. Doctors made it clear that if the baby survived, he would remain profoundly disabled, needing care for life. But life was unlikely to be long either. Doctors unanimously advised to give up the crumb. But how? How could one abandon this touching pale baby with expressive eyes? He already recognized Laurel, looked at her, tried to smile at his grandmother. True, Linda for some time was determined to give up her son. What do I need him for? An invalid. All the more I will still give birth to another healthy. It's horrible. Laurel tried to get through to her daughter. He's a human being. What will he be like in an orphanage? And then Linda had a sudden change of heart. She said that of course she would take Willie home. As it turned out later, a friend with many children convinced the young mother. The children are entitled to benefits. There are even more for the disabled. That's all it was. Willie was discharged. The arrival of the child did not affect Linda's lifestyle. With a light heart, she was free to go home and sleep in a normal environment. Willie was on welfare, so Linda was now walking around with her own source of income. She became even more popular in certain circles. Seeing this, Laurel didn't even try to reason with her daughter. She realized it was useless. Such was the irresistible power of genes. Laurel didn't blame herself for what had happened to Linda. She knew she had given her daughter enough time and done everything she could to raise her to be a decent person. Now Laurel Swan was taking care of Willie, treating him, developing him, traveling with the baby to doctors. Of course, people, including doctors, wondered where the child's mother was, why his upbringing was being taken care of by his grandmother. Laurel lied to everyone, saying that her daughter was working so that her son would have everything he needed. And she, the grandmother, was only helping the young mother of a disabled child. No, Laurel was not ashamed of her daughter's behavior. She hadn't been afraid of people's judgment for a long time. She was afraid of something else. Linda could be deprived of parental rights, and Willie will go to boarding school. It is unlikely that he will be left to his grandmother. Neither the conditions in their house are not so good, nor the age for guardianship is already old enough, and the income is meager. So Laurel got by, giving birth to her grandson as best she could. And then Linda brought home her husband, a grown man with red, cloudy eyes from constant drinking, and announced that he would now live here. Laurel thought it couldn't get any worse and harder for her. But it turned out she was wrong. This Adrian made her existence a living hell. He immediately felt like the owner of someone else's house. Adrian emptied the refrigerator without a care in the world. He didn't care if Laurel used the last of her money to buy fruit or milk for Willie. The man never cleaned up after himself, swearing loudly at Linda and Laurel if something was out of place. Sometimes he even got handsy. And now they had a bunch of Adrian's buddies over to their house. It was unbearable. All night long, the youths were buzzing in the kitchen. Mats, loud laughter, swearing, cigarette smoke all over the house, glasses clinking. Sometimes even fights broke out. Willie was restless in his sleep. Laurel sat next to him. She couldn't sleep. There was no telling what might happen, a fire or something. No, one had to stay alert. Linda was quite happy with this existence. She defended Adrian to her mother, as if she didn't notice her husband's rough treatment of both of them. I couldn't leave. How could I leave Willie with them? Grandmother waved a jinx at the sudden return of her tears. My grandson loved me. I was his only hope, and for his sake I put up with all this. I would have run away a long time ago. In fact, that's what I did when Willie. From the very beginning, the disabled boy was expected to live a short life, but grandmother hoped for a medical error and the power of modern medicine. At first the kid seemed to be doing well, but then the disease took its toll. Every day the boy grew weaker, thinner, became indifferent to what was happening. Nothing pleased him. His grandmother went to the hospital with him. At first they lay in the ward together, Then the child was transferred to the intensive care unit. That was it. The grandmother sobbed for several days when the doctors told her the terrible news. The daughter and her roommate were saddened only by the fact that they lost their source of income. Well, one more, the daughter shrugged. It's a simple matter, the man smirked. The grandmother, listening to this dialogue, realized no, she couldn't stay in the same house with her daughter for another minute. This is some kind of alien, scary, heartless creature. Here I packed my things and ran away here to Moscow. My pension is quite meager. My daughter took out loans in my name, and now the bailiffs are deducting them from my pension. I get pennies, but nothing. Time is passing. I'll pay it off soon. I sleep in a hostel. I don't have my own place. But it's better than enduring the antics of my daughter and her roommate. I don't always have enough to eat, so I do it at night near restaurants and cafes. You don't have the security guards like other places. That's why I come here a lot. I didn't even know you owned this place. So, life has turned around. The restaurant owner shook his head. What he had heard did not fit in his head. This kind, caring woman, a talented teacher, and lives like this. Collects food almost on the garbage dump. My heart squeezed with pity for this bright person. The teacher did not deserve such a fate. But now everything will change. To believe or not to believe, he began suddenly. But I've been looking for you. I've been looking for you for a long time, just to thank you. And now I've found you. You'll have your own apartment now. Cozy, clean, just like it used to be. If your pension isn't enough to live on, you'll work part-time as a tutor. You're a great teacher. You love your work. And people need your knowledge. I have friends whose school children need extra lessons. They will be only happy to such a tutor like you. And the pay will be good, don't even doubt it. I hate to put you to such a strain, the woman replied. Consider it a debt I'm repaying. It must have been hard for you to pay off that loan you took out to send me to the contest. And this help cost me nothing now. I'm glad. I also need you to meet my children. And you know my wife, she will be very glad to see you. The teacher smiled as she looked at her former student. Yes, I'm looking forward to seeing your and Irina's children too. I'm so happy for you.